On behalf of Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, Chitkara University, Punjab, I, Assistant Professor Surbhi Modi, would like to welcome you all for day 2 of the event titled Rediscovering Modern Heritage Through Climate Resilience and Sustainability, Case of Chandigarh and Ahmedabad. After a successful discussion on the modern heritage case studies of Chandigarh and Ahmedabad, along with the guided tours yesterday, we shall begin today with the discussion of the site visit at Capitol Complex, Chandigarh, guided by Dr. Arman Singh. I wish to bring out that we had about 40 participants for the tour. I now invite Mr. Rohit Jain, Associate Professor, Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, Chitkara University, Punjab, for discussing the site visit with the participants. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Rohit is a little occupied, and till the time Rohit will join in the discussion, I am going to moderate this discussion. So I would request to have all the participants on the screen with their videos on. Can I see the gallery view of all the participants, sir? Out of the participants, is there anybody who was there with us on the site visit yesterday? Or anybody who wants to begin a discussion about the Capitol complex and the conservation process done at the Capitol complex? Sanyam Ravi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, even if you don't switch your video on, you want to discuss something, or probably you can just brief out the key takeaways of yesterday's discussion. I also see more participants joining in. I think Ishika Chopra is in the meeting.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you switch your video on, please?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. A very good morning to you, Ishika.
Good morning, ma'am.
Okay, so let's begin our discussion about yesterday's site visit. Can you just say a few words or say some key takeaways of what you learned on the site yesterday? Have you been to the Capitol complex earlier?
Yes, ma'am, but I haven't experienced it from the inside. I've just seen it,
Okay.
but haven't been inside the building.
Okay, so how was your last experience different from yesterday's experience?
Yesterday, we got to know the architectural perspective of the building, like how they're made efficient according to the climate and, nature responsive, and how all the buildings are different, yet they are complementing each other in the Capitol complex. So,
what was your key learning out of yesterday's site visit?
my key learning was that to, make the building as efficient as possible without using artificial measures. The way he measures, like, fans and lights, how can we make the building more efficient?
In terms of climatic responsiveness.
Yes, yes.
So what made you think like this when you say that, we should not, resort to artificial means, and we must have natural climatic responsiveness in the buildings? So what were the basic features you observed during your site visit in the Capitol?
One was the sun cutting, which was used in all of the buildings. And then the roof, there was a double cavity roof to, restrict the heat of the building. And also the windows were placed at an angle, and the wind flow was only, letting in the cooler air into the building. So once we were standing outside and it was very heated and, warm outside. But once we entered, it was relatively cooler. So,
okay. So what all buildings did you experience during your site visit yesterday?
Ma'am, we went to the Secretariat building,
okay,
and then the Legislative Assembly, And we have seen the High Court from the outside, but we didn't go into it.
Okay.
And
So,
the other monuments.
Thank you, Ishika. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your visit and had good takeaways from yesterday's visit. Can we have the next participant who went yesterday to give their key takeaways? For the information of all the participants who logged in today, we also had one participant from Barcelona, Miss Adrian, who happened to also be at the CEPT University, I think last year, that's what she mentioned, and she volunteered to have this guided tour with us. So she was also there, and she was amazed at the fact that, the entire Capitol complex became accessible to all of us, thanks to Dr. Arman and his team, who made absolutely wonderful arrangements for our delegation to visit each nook and corner of the site, except for, places which were, of course, in function, being a working day. So when we started our tour, we started straight away from the Secretariat building. And because the sessions were on and the offices were working in the Secretariat building, so we walked through the interesting ramps that the building have, and then we went across straight on the 10th floor to experience the entire plaza of the Capitol complex, and also experience the Secretariat terrace and the rooftops of all the buildings which the Capitol complex have. So any other student? Mansi, can we have your mic on and your camera on? Sanyam or anyone else?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Sanyam. So over to you on your takeaways, on what you learned about what is conservation, or probably about what are World Heritage Sites. I don't know whether you knew what World Heritage Sites are not. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I learned about how beautifully he didn't use any artificial thing, how beautifully he shuttering. Main thing was shuttering. In the Secretary building, I looked at the ramp and how beautifully shuttering was arranged at the angle of the ramp, so that it appears beautiful from the outside as well, without any treatment at the facade.
So which means the lines of the shuttering became architectural elements of the exposed concrete work in itself.
Yes, ma'am.
Of course, that is very fascinating, and that is the primary challenge now the conservation architects and the conservation professionals are facing while maintaining and restoring and conserving this Capitol complex, because concrete has its own life. So it's almost 62 years that this ensemble is standing here. I think it was brought out in 1960. It came into being. So
Yes,
from 1960 to 2022, in these 62 years, it has been exposed to various external agencies in terms of changing climatic conditions and all other forces, So
yes,
the entire challenge becomes as to how to, have this concrete facade in its original sense without using any artificial material. I mean, would you recommend to clad it with some artificial material in the years to come?
No, ma'am. After seeing this, I don't think I recommend anyone to use any artificial material for the cladding, or it's so beautiful as it is. What an amazing use of the material as a beautification.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Anything else that you want to say? Or you learned?
Ma'am, I didn't know Lee Corbusier as when I experienced him, as when I experienced his buildings. I am a fan of Le Corbusier now.
I'm glad. So I mean, this is a very good key takeaway. Being in Chitkara University, as a student of Chitkara University, and not knowing who Corbusier is and not visiting the Capitol complex, I term it as a crime. So I'm glad that you are not a criminal anymore and you are now a fan of Corbusier. Good.
Yes. Okay.
Anyone else? Rakhi? So anybody wants to throw some light on the kind of conservation process which was discussed in the site visit yesterday and the kind of issues which were faced during these conservation processes? Okay, so for the participants, I see Ritika and I see many other participants who were not there as a part of a guided site visit yesterday. So for your information, we went to the Capitol complex as a part of our event, and the whole idea of this guided tour was to acquaint the participants with the historical significance of the Capitol complex. I'm sure most of us know it, but still it was brought out on the site. And of course, you know, when you talk about the historical significance of the Capitol complex standing on the site, it makes more sense to all of the participants. And thereafter, you know, there were some at some places, some part of the construction process was on, which was being monitored and done by Dr. Arman Singh, who was also there with us yesterday. And he showed us how the roof of the terrace flooring of the Secretariat building was being relaid. You know, very interestingly, what they had done was they had kind of taken off the originally precast concrete slabs which were there on the terrace, and the double roofing, the double flooring of the roof of the Secretariat was being redone because of the problem of water seepage in that roof. So I invite Tanvi, if she's there and she can hear me, to unmute herself and switch her camera on to throw some light on what she learned about this double roofing system, which was being, you know, done there on the site. Tanvi, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, but I'm facing very weak connection right now. Is it possible for me to answer just like this?
Yes, you may not switch your video on, but you can just go on if you want to say something about this process that you saw yesterday.
Yes, ma'am. We actually also saw how they've created a buffer for the heat barrier, and how there was a gap between the actual roofing and the roofing below it because of the columns. And then this is one strategy that I picked up from there, where how they had created a heat barrier. And also one more thing, I think they were talking about how water was going in, so they were actually going to refill the whole thing and then put the original slabs again because of how functional they were actually. So instead of, they were not going to put new concrete slabs. So this is also one more fascinating thing, that the slabs that were created so many years ago was still very much functional and very much strong. And I think, yeah, and also like you mentioned about the water seepage thing. So I think that is also one problem that would be resolved, because sir also mentioned how there's a lot of rainfall, especially in that particular region and away from the city. So I think now that problem will not be there. So yeah, that is what I learned from it.
Thank you, Tanvi. And for the audience, I would want to tell you that this was brought out by Dr. Arman yesterday, that Capitol, you know, is the head of the, Chandigarh city in the northernmost part of the city. And because of its proximity to being close to, this Kasauli and Parvanu and the hills around, it's very interesting to that Dr. Arman told that Capitol complex site is the first to experience heavy rain showers. Even if there are no rain showers being experienced by the city residents of Chandigarh, it is generally seen that Capitol complex is experiencing rain showers. So because of this and the heavy rainpours that this place experiences, there have been a lot of water seepage over the rooftops, and those water seepages were seen at many places inside the ceiling of the buildings, where there were patchy works which were done, which had developed over time, and a lot of work was being done to get those patches repaired and removed during the process of conservation. Okay, anyone else wants to take on? Abnish.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. Okay, so can you talk about the Legislative Assembly building a little bit? What did you see there? What did you learn there? And what was the conservation process which fascinated you in the legislative building?
Ma'am, when we went inside the Legislative Assembly building of Punjab and Haryana, we saw how Sir Le Corbusier had empathized with every group of people who would access it. Like he had created ramps for the people who would not be able to use the steps to go up. And then next, when we went inside the Vidhan Sabha of Punjab, we saw how he had created he had innovated different types of you can say sound insulation so that all the heated arguments, the sound noise of the heated arguments do not go outside, and the people who visit the other people who visit the Legislative Assembly or the for a visit, for just a visiting purpose, they did not get to hear the heated argument that is going inside the Vidhan Sabha. So that is what was very that is something that fascinated me a lot, and it is something which inspired me to use in my next if I get a chance to create any project or any project which would include something like this, which would focus mainly on acoustics. So this is something I would like to use. And also, when we got to know what material he used for sound insulation, like he used jute bags and filled with cotton inside. So that is very, I would say, economical. So economical. So that is also something that highly inspired me for while I visited the place. And the structure that he had made, the way he had used the materials, that is also something which was very innovative and something very unique for me. So that is what I had learned yesterday, and yes, ma'am, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think very well spoken and very good point raised that the kind of materials Corbusier chose for acoustic treatment of these assembly halls was very eco-friendly also, and very long lasting and easy to maintain. So yesterday, while we were there on the site, I asked Dr. Arman that what is the kind of conservation action taken for these acoustic panels which are there in the Punjab Assembly building, I mean the hall of the Punjab Assembly. So he says that these are functioning well, the acoustic is functioning absolutely well, and they needed no treatment because they're absolutely in order. There is very, very less damage or degradation being experienced by these acoustic panels which are there inside the hall. So one key takeaway that I learned yesterday was that we might be using fancy materials or lot of materials which keep coming in the market, but along with today's cost and today's use, we also have to see that how well it is going to function in the times to come, because that is very important. So if you look at the assembly building and the Punjab Assembly Hall, the 62-year-old acoustic panels are functioning absolutely well. And the engineers and the architects have a doubt that will we be able to really maintain it or redo something which functions as well as the acoustic panels which were installed way back in 1960. So that was the only apprehension, and therefore they thought that because it is absolutely intact and it has not experienced degradation with time, so they should not be treated or given any different kind of surfaces. So that is why they have not touched it. In the assembly building, more so what they have done is that in the late, in the early 21st century, as a part of, renovating the Capitol complex, the large part of the assembly building, the columns and a lot of other exposed concrete surfaces were paneled with wood. So one of the primary things that have been taken over in this conservation process was bringing back the original fabric of the buildings and removing the artificial cladding of wood on the walls and on the columns of the building. So yesterday when I went there about around 3 years ago, I saw a sea change in the assembly hall and in the foyer of the assembly hall, where all the paneling, the wooden paneling, was absolutely removed and it was brought back to its original character of exposed concrete work. Okay, does anybody want to highlight about the kind of site planning or about the juxtapositioning of the different elements of the Capitol complex? Let's say the three main buildings, which was the Secretariat and the High Court building and the Legislative Assembly, and the other monuments like the Open Hand or the Martyrs Memorial or the Geometric Hill. How well do you appreciate their location and the site planning of this entire complex, which was also discussed in detail yesterday on the site? Good morning, Vasu.
Good morning, ma'am.
Okay, so can you talk about what you learned about the site planning of the Capitol complex yesterday?
Yes, ma'am, sure. Ma'am, जैसे कि हम, ma'am, can I speak in Hindi also?
You can use your own language, which is understandable by all, and if you can switch your camera on.
Sure, ma'am. Just a minute, ma'am. I think I have not given the permission. Just a minute. मैम मेन तो कल हमने क्या कहते हैं, जैसे कि ले कबूतर के डिजाइन्स के बारे में हमने सिर्फ पढ़ा था, इमेजेस में देखा था, नेट पे देखा था। कल हमें जाके उसके बारे में पता चला कि कैसे उन्होंने बनाया हुआ है, कैसे हर चीज को इनकॉर्पोरेट करा हुआ है, कि कैसे कैपिटल बिल्डिंग के अराउंड ऐसे उन्होंने, जैसे कि चाहे हम सिक्योरिटी के बारे में बात करें, चाहे उसकी एंट्रेंसेस के लिए बात करें, चाहे उन्होंने पब्लिक के लिए अलग करी है, कैसे उन्होंने ऑफिशियल्स के लिए अलग एंट्रीज दी हैं, और अब कैसे कि अब मेन जहाँ पे हॉल था, जहाँ पे वो टावर ऑफ शेडोज था और हाई कोर्ट था, उसके बीच में कैसे उन्हें डिस्टेंस रखा कि सबसे पहले कैपिटल बिल्डिंग है जहाँ पे सारे एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव है, फिर उसके बाद एक सेंट्रल गैलरी आ गई जहाँ पे खाली है, फिर उसके बाद हमारा हाई कोर्ट आता है, जिससे डिस्टेंस मेंटेन हो जाता है हर एक अंदर की। कैसे कि पहले अब हमारे रूल्स बनेंगे, यहाँ पे डिसाइड होंगे, उसके बाद कहाँ पे अप्रूव होंगे, तो एक वो ह्यूमन साइकोलॉजी वाली पार्ट भी आ जाता है उसके अंदर, उसकी साइट प्लानिंग के अंदर भी। और फिर उसके अराउंड कैसे उन्हें सारी ग्रीनरी को इनकॉर्पोरेट करा हुआ था साइट की, कि एक विजुअल बैरियर भी बन जाए कि बिल्डिंग के अराउंड के अगर वहां पे टावर ऑफ शेडोज है तो उसको वहां से हम एक वो जो उन्होंने माउंट सा बना रखा, उसे एक विजुअल बैरियर भी बना, और उसके ऊपर उन्होंने एक पे जैसे स्वास्तिक बनाया था, एक पे सन पाथ का डायग्राम बनाया हुआ, जिससे वो एक एम्फोसिस भी बन रहा है, विजुअल बैरियर भी बन रहा है, और वो डिजाइन में इनकॉर्पोरेट भी हो रहा है, हर चीज उसके अंदर आ रही है। और रही बात बिल्डिंग के अंदर के डिजाइन की, तो हमने तो सिर्फ एक फोटो हमेशा उसके बारे में सुना था, कैसे रिबन विंडोज होती हैं, कैसे उसके ह्यूज कॉलम्स होते हैं। कल देखा खुद कि कैसे उसके अंदर रिबन विंडोज हैं टॉप पे, जिससे एक इतनी ज्यादा उसकी विड्थ नहीं थी, लेकिन लेंथ में इतनी है कि अंदर सारी बिल्डिंग के अंदर सनलाइट आ रही है। नेचुरल सनलाइट के साथ साथ हमें आर्टिफिशियल अगर हम लाइट भी दे रहे हैं तो इतनी नहीं देनी पड़ रही कि सुबह के टाइम में जरूरत पड़ेगी, अंदर रोशनी ही नहीं है कि दिख ही ना अंदर कुछ भी। और ह्यूज कॉलम्स तो उन्होंने दिए ही थे। उसके बाद कैसे उन्होंने रैम्प भी प्रोवाइड किया बिल्डिंग के अंदर, कि बाहर नहीं लगाई कि मतलब बिल्डिंग का फसाड ना खराब हो, तो उन्होंने बिल्डिंग के अंदर ही कहाँ पे दिए उन्होंने सारे। उसके अराउंड उन्होंने छोटी छोटी विंडोज भी दी, मल्टी कलर्स में दी। तो हर चीज के बारे में हम कल सीखने को मिला, ले कबूतर के डिजाइन, ले कबूतर के आइडियाज जो थे, कैसे रॉ तो कितना कुछ कर सकते हैं। नहीं तो कंक्रीट एक सिंपल हमारा हम कहते हैं, लेकिन उसे कैसे उन्होंने कहते शटरिंग को उन्होंने गोल गोल घुमा के, और शटरिंग का डिजाइन ना दिखे तो उन्होंने वो एस्बेस्टॉस शीट थी, और एस्बेस्टॉस नहीं सॉरी वो शीट उन्होंने यूज करी थी। ताकि वो क्या कहते हैं अंदर एको भी क्रिएट ना हो इतने ज्यादा कंक्रीट के अंदर, हर चीज का कैसे उन्होंने ध्यान रखा। तो काफी चीजें मैम कल सीखने को मिली मैम।
थैंक यू वासु। सो जो आपने रैंप की बात की है, द रैम्प्स generally when we tell you guys, or generally when ramps are supposed to be incorporated in any design, I mean, that's how we take it. We incorporate ramps. We do not think ramps to be integral part of our designs.
Yes,
and we understand how Corbusier did way back in 1960 when these buildings were built. The ramps were not a mandate. Now, because they are a mandate, everybody has to have a ramp. But that time the ramps were not even a mandate, yet each building that you see there, each building has a ramp in it. But these ramps are so well integrated within the designs that they actually function to be an architectural expression or a unique architectural feature of the building, rather than just being there for the functional purpose or to fulfill the norms of universal access. So ramps were very, very integral to all the designs of Corbusier, whether you look at the Capitol Complex building or whether you look at a lot of buildings in Ahmedabad. The two case studies which were presented yesterday, the mill owners building also is accessed by a very interesting ramp, which becomes the entry feature and an exceptional feature to that building. So similarly in the Secretariat building, the way he's excluded the ramp from the main facade of the building adds to its external element also, an architectural expression also, and of course adds to the functioning and the kind of variation in the temperature you could feel. Outside it was so hot, and as in when we entered the building and while we were walking over the ramp going to the 10th floor, we were not feeling the heat at all. So that's the beauty of how Corbusier designed the ramp and the punctures which were given in the ramp, which also kept it illuminated and climatically comfortable during the summer season also.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am.
Thank you. Umika,
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. Can you also talk about what you learned as a process of conservation, which was done and which was explained by Dr. Arman in the Haryana Assembly Hall? The tapestry, did you see the tapestry in the Haryana Assembly Hall? I think there's some connection error. She's lost connection. Anybody else wants to talk about the tapestry, which was there in the huge wall, which was covered with a very interesting original tapestry designed by Corbusier? Okay, so I think we are nearing to the end of this discussion, and anyone, probably Tanvi or Ishika, in a few words could sum up yesterday's visit and the key takeaway of what conservation is all about and how significant is such a process for such World Heritage properties. Ishika?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, I can hear you.
I feel that the building in itself is, climate responsive and showing brutalism also. And to restore it is a very big challenge. Okay. To restore it is a very big challenge, in my opinion, as as Sir yesterday also told us, that it takes time to get the approval, and you cannot even, if something happens, if you're not able to restore it properly to its original form, so all the other buildings also you've been conserving comes at risk. So I think it is a very sensitive and empathetic process that you have to follow towards the building, and to not disturb it as much as possible. Just restore the things which are out of function now. For example, he said that the jute acoustics were still functional. So we're not planning to change it. And wherein the dampness is coming, and for example, the fire safety was not there earlier. So that is something which needs to be provided. But other than that, we should refrain from, making it a developed or not developed. I'd rather say that in changing it in a matter, it won't look similar to its original form. That's what I feel.
Okay. Thank you, Ishika. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us for this discussion. We will take a short break and come back at 10:30 to continue the event. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I, Harveen Bhandari, Dean Research and Scholastic Development, Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, Chitkara University, Punjab, welcome everyone to session 3, Global Perspectives, Research Possibilities and Way Forward. Today's session, we now have, I invite 4 eminent speakers, and I hope they've all joined. Professor Kanika Bansal, Dean Advanced Studies, CSPA, Engineer Arman Singh, Subdivisional Engineer, Engineering Department, Chandigarh Administration. These 2 people accompanied for the site visit in Chandigarh yesterday. Simultaneously, architect Jayashree Bardhan, member ICOMOS and associate member of ICOR, and architect Nigar Sheikh, conservation engineer, Ahmedabad. They guided the visit held at Ahmedabad yesterday. So I invite them for presenting an overview of the site visits and Chandigarh and Ahmedabad. We begin with team CSPA. So I would invite Professor Kanika Bansal for that.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Harveen, for giving me this opportunity to give this overview of the visit that we did yesterday. The site that was chosen for the visit yesterday was the Capitol Complex, Chandigarh, which is a World Heritage Site we are all familiar with. So for the visit to the Capitol Complex, there were about 40 registered participants, including an international architect, Adriana from Barcelona, who also mentioned that she'd been to CEPT and also knows Dr. Desai. The tour began from the Secretariat building, walking through the ramp. The participants were taken to the terrace at the 10th floor, from where a complete view of the complex was seen, including the Legislative Building, the High Court Building, the Tower of Shadows, the Geometric Hill, the Open Hand, and the Martyrs Memorial. Dr. Arman gave an overview of the history and the significance of the Capitol Complex being a transnational UNESCO World Heritage Site, and how the process of conservation is done for the site with universal significance. We could also see how the exposed concrete was undergoing decay over these years after it was built in 1960, and what is the kind of action which is needed for this concrete and its damage to be controlled for the future. He also detailed the process of relaying the terrace flooring for curing water seepage through the roof using the traditional process as was also employed originally. He also mentioned that these original RCC slabs which were there on the roof would be relayed after the first layer of the roof was relayed to cure the water seepage, and thereafter these slabs, which were precast concrete slabs, would be relayed. During the visit within the Legislative Building, the students were sensitized on the way the integrity of the historic fabric was restored by removing the wooden paneling done all over the columns. It was also brought out by Dr. Arman that there was a lot of retrofitting done within the building to make it compliant with the fire safety norms, and we see these red pipes running through, and there were a lot of installations of the fire sensors and the fire sprinklers in order to have the compliance of the fire safety norms. The black painted roof is also maintained regularly for removing the patches which are developed over time because of water seepage. We also see a lot of seepage in the roof inside and a lot of patches which have developed in the roof, which are also underway in the process of conservation and is going to be taken care of very soon. While we were there in the legislative building and walking across this ramp, which takes you to the first floor of the building, there were these very interesting mosaics or probably some patterns which were seen. Now, even Dr. Arman was not aware whether these are the original inlays in the concrete exposed surface or they were made out afterwards. But the two showed, there was a fish which was made, if you see the inset on the right-hand side, and there were two camels, on the lower, divided by probably a horizon line, and I do not understand the concept. So this was just discovered yesterday by me. I'll read across books on Capitol Complex or probably interact with Mr. S.D. Sharma, who was also a part of this when it was being made, to know what it actually symbolizes and reflects. Inside the Punjab and Haryana Assembly Hall too, most of the work included bringing back the original character of the place by removing the wooden cladding that was done over the exposed concrete. So this, the previous picture is of, sorry, I don't know. The last slide. Yeah, this picture shows the Haryana Assembly Hall and the mention of the columns by Dr. Arman yesterday. We see this column, which was paneled by wooden cladding earlier, is now standing with exposed concrete surface. And the tapestry that we see there on the rear end is the tapestry that he was mentioning, which is about 20 meters wide and 9 meters high, which has been restored in its original form and has been placed over there. This is the Punjab Assembly Hall, where we were talking about the acoustic panels this morning during the discussion, and we see these organic black forms which are there on this hyperbolic paraboloid shaped assembly hall, which were primarily to control the sound echoes within the assembly building while the sessions are going on. And as mentioned by Dr. Arman, they function absolutely well, and not much has been done to restore or conserve them, because they are functioning well and have not experienced much damage and degradation over these 60 years. What was generally and largely undertaken in the Punjab Assembly Hall was again in sync to how it was done in the Haryana Assembly Hall, that the wooden claddings were removed to have the entire exposed concrete back in place. So this place where you see us standing, Dr. Arman, Adrian and me, the rear wall, the half-height wall here, this was earlier cladded with wood, which was now standing bare in exposed concrete, which was a part of the conservation process done in the assembly hall. The whole process resolved and revolved, bringing back the original fabric of the property. And here we see the very interesting, big, voluminous, high-scale doors, which were painted from inside and outside by Corbusier. And there has been no repair and maintenance done over these doors, and they stand as such in their original paints, which were done in 1960s. And on the right hand side, the third picture that we see here is the damage being done to the roof of the Tower of Shadows, and they are evaluating the kind of damage which is being done on this roof, and the conservation action will soon take place for this Tower of Shadows. So the entire process of this, and we could not manage to take the delegation to the High Court because the courts were in session and we were not allowed to go around the High Court. So we explained the High Court building from the piazza itself, and the open hand was also discussed in the piazza itself. And the entire process, and my delegation seemed to be very happy because most of them did not go to the Capitol complex primarily because of the COVID outbreak for the past 2 years. And we had one international visitor who was so delighted to be a part of this delegation, all thanks to Dr. Arman, who thought, because of whom we could go to all parts and were also allowed to click photographs during the visit. So thank you very much. Over to you, Jayashree and Nigar, for an overview of the site visit to Ahmedabad.
Thank you, Professor Bansal, for this great insight into your guided tour that you took yesterday. Very, very similar to what you just said, that many of our students haven't been to Atma because of the COVID lockdown, and it's also a building that needs permission. So we also had a lot of participation of Masters in Conservation and Regeneration students for Atma. We also had a few people from Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation join us, and one or two people who guide the guided tours in the old city. They also joined us. So it was good. Since the Faculty of Architecture building already has been guided several times, we had a few students, but while we were moving from space to space, and Nigar was explaining the different conservation processes, and it's jury time in CEP. So some students kept joining in the individual studios. And Nigar will explain the technical details and the discussions that took place. But while we were in Atma, we first began with the overall significance, the history of the place. Nigar talked about the specific conservation issues. She could talk about a comparative study of both buildings, since we have recently done some conservation at the FA building. Students could see similarities in both the buildings, how the concrete is going through certain processes. And at Atma, we also talked about the larger issues, like, for example, the context, the relationship to the river has changed. Taller buildings have started coming up. It's relatively a well-maintained building, but the use has changed completely because it's no longer a textile hub. So programmatically, what can be done? And we had a little brainstorming session on what do you think can be the new program? And if people of the city should consider this building as their heritage, then what should the program of a public building be? And there were some very weird suggestions and some good suggestions. And so I think it was more of a brainstorming session. I'll take you through a few photographs, and then Nigar will quickly take you through the specific structural and material details that she... All right, I hope the screen is visible now. So that's the FA building, and Nigar walking through the studios, explaining the entire conservation process. And the central photograph, you can see that people are working for the juries next week. That's at the Millowners building, where we started with the brief history of the city, how significance is not only related to the material conservation, but also the underlying principles of the modernist movement. And we discussed a little bit of that. Here, they are looking at the east and the west facade of the building. This is the west facade of the building, talking about the Brise Soleil. These are specific issues that students are discussing at the ground floor of Atma. That's the east facade of the building, and specific things that you see because of the planters, and since it's exposed to the riverside. And this entire relationship to the river has sort of changed because of the riverfront project that has come up. And earlier it was right on the bank of the river. And some photographs. That's, of course, our common heritage. That's the permanent exhibit in Atma on Chandigarh. And lastly, the brainstorming session, students' ideas of what can be done, and a little wrap up of what they saw, what they thought, how are the problems in the School of Architecture building similar or different from Atma, concrete conservation related issues. Yeah, that's it. And Nigar, I invite you to tell us about the specific structural and technical issues that you were discussing with the students.
Thank you, Jayashree. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, so as Jayashree mentioned, we started from FA building, which the students were already versed of how the conservation process had taken place, but we guided them through the specific techniques that we had used, like use of polymer modified mortar, that is microconcrete for repairs, how few slabs had to be recasted, and what was the reason of that, like inadequate cover, complete corrosion of the reinforcement bar, because all the top slabs of FE building, like Jigna ma'am mentioned yesterday in her presentation, the waterproofing was not adequate and we had to recast them. So we started from the top, explaining how these problems are in the FE building, talking about masonry problems, major cracks in masonries that were repaired using C-clamp. The other problems which were there during the construction of FA building, workmanship problems like honeycombing patches were there, segregation was there. So we pointed out these aspects of FA building and how they were repaired using microconcrete or recasting or rebarring. So once the student then went to Atma building, they had an eye of these defects and they could actually point out certain defects and ask that, okay, is this honeycombing? Okay, what should be the conservation process for honeycombing? We can use microconcrete here for repair. So the comparison was quite clear, and the students had their thinking cap on when they went to Atma, and they could actually point out these problems. Certain problems that we, made them see were like how water, and wherever there are drainage pipes in Atma, you would see problems of effluents, start of alkali aggregate reactions. You would see, because of the plantation, as Jayashree mentioned, all those beams showing corrosion, heavy corrosion. There are cracks parallel to the horizontal reinforcement. So we kept seeing these problems. We also saw there is a bat infestation at Atma building, and how to deal with such kind of parasites that are there on the building. It's an open building, there is nothing you can close Atma building with. So there are a lot of challenges like we had in FA building. It's a building in use. Overuse actually. Faculty of Architecture building gets exploited. We could already see a minor damage at one corner created, maybe by shifting of furnitures by the student or by the staff. So the building gets exploited in many ways. And similarly, Atma has its own challenges that it's not being used, it's not being maintained. So there are these factors like water leakage, which is not being accounted for. There are problems like parasitic problems like bats and other, you could see anyone can walk in and walk out because the building is open. There's no maintenance right now. So, and as Jayashree said, at the end, we had a very brainstorming session with the students discussing these problems, the technical problems that we saw at Atma, comparing them with FA building and how, we can have similar mode of conservation, technique of conservation for Atma. Atma also had slender elements like FA building, inadequate cover, which we saw at Faculty of Architecture building. Plus, there were a lot of these patches of honeycombing, which are workmanship, problems, which must have happened during the time of pouring of concrete, less compaction. So the parallels were well driven, and it was a fruitful discussion, and the students could think about, alternatives. They were thinking about the conservation techniques and processes. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigar. Thanks. Over to you, Professor Bansal.
Thank you very much for this interesting discourse on your site visits. And just like Nigar mentioned, this morning when we had a discussion, since most of the participants of the tour yesterday were students of CSPA, so the takeaways were so delightful, and I was so happy, of course, as a teacher also, that the students were overwhelmed, they were thrilled, and so much so that one of the students also says that now I'm a big fan of Corbusier. And I will ensure, that I have a ramp at least in all the buildings that I design. So if we could even inspire, one or two of our students, I think we've done a good job yesterday. So the discussions were very fruitful and they seemed to be very happy and elated about how Corbusier has envisioned the entire Capitol complex, specifically because unko kal garmi nahi lagi. They were feeling the heat outside the buildings, but as soon as they entered the building, everything became absolutely comfortable. So they were so happy that way back in 1960, when there were no air conditioners, the buildings are self-cooled. The breeze could be felt over there. So probably this response, if they understand and if they start to inculcate in their architecture, the battle is won. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jayashree. Thank you, Nigar. Thank you very much. Over to Dr. Bhandari.
Thank you, Kanika ma'am. Thank you, Jayashree. I think the students and the participants enjoyed the site visits. Moving on to the first presentation for today's session, that is Tools for Quantitative Research in Cultural Heritage. I take the privilege to introduce Dr. Amit Mittal, Dean-Doctoral Research Center, Chitkara University, Punjab. Dr. Mittal has over 2 decades of domestic and international experience in academic leadership, teaching, research, consulting, training, and mentorship. His current mandate is to manage the PhD program specifically designed for working executives at Chitkara University. Sir is also the registry head for PhD program in architecture, art and design, health sciences. 14 scholars have been awarded PhD degrees under his guidance. He has published over 55 Scopus Index papers, with a number of these included in the ABDC-ABS journal list. He was also the recipient of Chitkara University Excellence Award 2021, February, for the highest cited author and publications with the highest H index in the business school category. Next slide, please. Sir is an active resource person for FDPs, MDPs, and corporate training. He is a member of the thesis review board of a number of universities and also a reviewer for reputable journals globally. He served the Oswal Education and Relief Board, Nairobi, Kenya for 3 years before joining Chitkara University in 2014. And I'm thankful he accepted our invitation for this presentation. I now welcome Sir for his presentation.
So very good morning. I can speak now. A very good morning, and thank you, Dr. Harveen, for the introduction. So I'd like to thank the organizers, CEPT University, Ahmedabad, and CSPA, Chitkara University, and a special thanks to Professor Kanika Bansal, who invited me for this brief talk on quantitative tools in cultural heritage. So this is an area which is, obviously as a consumer of heritage, I would understand what it means, but then I did not have the expertise from a research standpoint before preparing this particular presentation for today. So I was given this invite a couple of weeks ago, and I worked pretty hard to try and understand the nuances of heritage studies. So the idea is not to show my expertise in the area, which obviously I'm not an expert by any stretch of imagination. So the basic idea is to introduce the concept of quantitative tools in heritage research, something that over the past couple of weeks, when I did an extensive review of literature, I realized that quantitative analysis is pretty much alien to heritage studies. So I'll start with my presentation. In terms, just a primer to the theme, in terms of research approaches based on the data type, you would either have a mono method, a methodology which uses only one type of methodology. It could either be quantitative or it could be qualitative, or you could have multi-method. Multi-method is when you either use quantitative or qualitative, and within quantitative or qualitative, you use multiple techniques, right? So that is called multi-method research. The future is mixed method research. Incidentally, I could find very few, even though a lot of papers in some of the leading journals in heritage studies, they claim to be using mixed method research. But I can tell you as a reviewer of a lot of journals from some top publishers that most of them in reality, they use multi-method, but not a mixed method research. And when I say mixed method research, it means combining or blending quantitative and qualitative, these two designs together. The key characteristics of high quality scientific research, to begin with, it needs to take on grand challenges. Then you're looking at novelty or challenging the discourse and uniqueness. Third is the scope. Now, in terms of grand challenges, a starting point to consider when selecting a topic is whether the study confronts or contributes to grand challenge. Just a minute. The term grand challenge is credited to mathematician David Hilbert, whose list of important unsolved problems has encouraged innovation in mathematics research since the turn of the 20th century. Grand challenges, they have been applied to diverse fields in the natural sciences, in management, engineering, and medicine. The fundamental principles underlying a grand challenge are the pursuit of bold ideas and the adoption of less conventional approaches to tackling large unsolved problems. So the highlight is to the adoption of less conventional approaches. Incidentally, qualitative research is the convention, that is the default convention when I studied a whole lot of papers published in heritage studies. Having said this, research in the field of heritage studies is largely context-driven, or it is case-based, and it depends on qualitative or non-quantifiable research techniques to put forth its findings. Now, context or case-based research that follows only qualitative research design, it is flawed in some way, especially in terms of the validity or in terms of the generalizability. Similar to the fact that all monomethod studies, including quantitative studies, if a study is solely quantitative, they also are flawed in one way or the other. A better option is to follow a multi-method, or still better, a mixed method approach by combining qualitative design and quantitative design. The second point is novelty. Novelty is quantitative research. It can lead to novelty, especially in the field of heritage studies. And I say this because scientific research can be viewed as a conversation that takes place among scholars. Addressing it would change the conversation already taking place in a given literature. Does the study merely add to the momentum that is created by the existing voices? Or does it really cause heads to turn conversation in an entirely new direction? Novel topics can often result from knowledge recombination with something new being created by building a bridge between two disciplines, which is multidisciplinary. In fact, that is the way forward as far as the National Education Policy 2020 also speaks about. So what I'm trying to hint at is the future of heritage studies it lies in multidisciplinary research. In terms of scope, when I say cast a wide net, casting a wider net, even the best topic ideas, they can be undermined if the resulting study is too small. Our discussion defines scope as a degree to which the landscape involved is a topic that is already adequately sampled in terms of relevant constructs, mechanisms, perspectives. Studies cannot tackle grand challenges if they are not ambitious. And unfortunately, qualitative studies by their design, they are very limited in scope. Right? I'm not trying to demean or condescend qualitative research, but what I'm trying to introduce is are the benefits going forward, the benefits of quantitative research. I'll take real-time examples of published papers. So I've taken 3 research papers, and these papers have been taken from some of the most reputable journals, 2 from the Journal of Heritage Studies and 1 from a research that was published in a seminal book. Now I'll talk about study number 1. This study was published by Bendix 2015, and this study deals with the theory in heritage conservation. Bendix proposes the concept of communities of patterns, where the communities of patterns represents individual actors or actor groups from within and without a community who find a particular type of heritage worthy of preservation. So they're talking about communities of patterns who would find a particular heritage worthy of being preserved. So they come together, they come forward, They serve as patterns or intermediaries to a community, and they assist with the work of getting a particular heritage onto the world stage, a task which generally requires a lot of resources. Now, this theory could explain how likely and why it is that people shall come forward to preserve a heritage site or heritage structure. This could be a predictive model. Now, where the study actually missed the bus is this study could have been based on a predictive model, but the current studies around this proposition are very, very limited. In fact, there's some recent work that was published in the International Journal of Heritage Studies, which was about some work that was done in Bulgaria. So the qualitative model, as I said, the qualitative study could have been followed by a quantitative predictive modeling. And Bendix Communities of Patterns presents a wonderful option, a wonderful opportunity for researchers to write a research paper taking this research forward. Second is by Jabaruti in 2021. These are all latest studies. This study, it identifies the problem of adoption of intangible heritage or IH in practice. This is study 2. This research is a case of barriers to practicing intangible heritage. According to the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, Western-built heritage assessment and management procedures are receiving growing criticisms for their role within a paradigm that conceptualizes listed buildings as objective representation of authenticity. Now, this is in direct conflict with the concept of intangible heritage, which is now receiving more attention. A newly published study by Jabaruti in this journal, it talks about a conceptual disconnect between what we would term as intangible heritage and tangible heritage. Now, based on qualitative study, which the author actually conducted a total of 16 interviews. So they came up with 5 barriers: role complexity, non-physical qualities, unclear domain relationship, uncertain definition, and participating problems. I will not go into the details of these individual barriers, but what I'm trying to put forth is that these 5 barriers are based only on interviews with 16 individuals, right? So based on 16 individuals, I feel that this research is very incomplete. So there is, again, a wonderful opportunity to extend the work of Jabaruti. And the opportunity lies in proposing a conceptual model, identifying measures for the 5 barriers. For example, role complexity could be converted into a construct which could be measured quantitatively. Test the model based on some kind of a quantitative technique, such as maybe a structure equation modeling or even multiple regression. I was looking at these papers, and I was really lost in terms of the lack of quantitative analysis, even a multiple regression, which I would consider to be very, very basic. That is something that could actually be added and could enrich the paper. Study number 3, this is by Sofer et al. And it talks about heritage sites, value and well-being, learning from COVID-19 in England. Heritage sites, value and well-being, learning from the COVID-19 pandemic. This study, it qualitatively discussed the articulation of heritage values that relate to how regaining access to heritage sites after the lockdown was used by visitors to support their mental health, either consciously or unconsciously. These values included notions of capability, social connections, perceived benefits, and trust. The field work was carried out at 7 heritage destinations in south of England. Data was collected by means of semi-structured interviews and participant observations, taking a grounded theory approach, which means that theories that they developed on their own was used. And now this study again is very incomplete. I believe this study could have been much better if the study was based on longitudinal data, because if you're talking about something post-COVID or during COVID-19, then you also have to have data before COVID. Otherwise, you cannot compare it. So if you have a research that is based on cross-sectional data or a data that is collected at one point in time, and you're trying to refer to something earlier or something in the future, then that is insufficient. Technically, that paper would not be published in a top quality social sciences journal, especially in the field of management, right? The constructs in this study were heritage values, well-being, and perceived benefits. And surprisingly, even though these 3 constructs could be studied qualitatively, but there are already established measures through which you can actually conduct a quantitative study. And I just created a very small tentative conceptual model. And this is perhaps somebody could take forward this paper of SOFR 2021, and you could create a model like this, and you can actually write your own research paper based on quantitative data. This is one excellent paper based on mixed methods, which combines quantitative and qualitative. I think this paper should be read by all budding researchers, especially those who are at the PhD level. And the best part about this research is this research was made possible, and it is now based on mixed method, largely because it is now multidisciplinary. So what they've done is they've combined heritage studies with tourism. Right. So that is why when the UGC, when the government of India says that in NEP 2020, that the future is multidisciplinary. So there's a reason behind it, right? So I'll just briefly talk about, give my case for quantitative design. It measures change, which qualitative study does not. It measures cause-effect relationship. Quantitative research designs, they enable you to generalize the phenomena under study. It lets you test a theory through deduction. Deduction means a theory that is already existing rather than induction, where you create your own theory, which is the norm in heritage studies. So heritage studies are based on induction rather than deduction. It allows you to analyze large data sets compared to the 16 interviews taken by SOFR. Here you can go for big data. You can have a data set that runs into millions of terabytes. It also protects the privacy. Qualitative research does not protect privacy of the respondent. And yes, quantitative designs are also cost effective. So that is what I had to say based on the theme that was offered to me. So thank you so much, and stay connected. And if anyone is interested in taking any of these studies forward, do get in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kanika, once again.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir has discussed in detail the key characteristics of high-quality scientific research in the field of cultural heritage. He has given some real examples from already published research papers. So publishing and analyzing work has become very important for all of us because they create important repositories for the generations to come. Thank you for giving us a new quantitative perspective to cultural heritage. And I'm sure a lot of researchers must have their queries resolved on various tools that can be applied for research in the domain of cultural heritage. Thank you once again. Proceeding to the next presentation, which will throw light on the ways the Getty Conservation Institute has taken up the challenge of conserving modern heritage. We are all familiar with this name. It needs no introduction. This is an institute. It's a private international research institute dedicated to advancing conservation practice through the creation and delivery of knowledge. It works to advance conservation practice in the visual arts and through the conservation of objects, collections, architecture, and site. The institute serves the conservation community through scientific research, education and training, field projects, and dissemination of information. Further, I would like to introduce Chandler McCoy from the Getty Conservation Institute. Sir is a specialist in the conservation of modern architecture and historic preservation planning. He manages the Conserving Modern Architecture initiative at the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles, whose mission is to advance the practice of conserving modern heritage. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in architecture from the University of Virginia and a master's from Columbia University in New York City. He studied architectural conservation at ICCROM in Rome. I welcome you for your presentation.
This lecture was given at CEPT in early in January. We've taken consent from Chandler to play this recording. It's an odd time for him from where he is right now to be present at this moment. He has given us consent to share his pre-recorded lecture. Thank you.
I've been asked to talk a bit to explain what the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative is and what projects we've been working on. And further to sort of explain why we're doing it. The Getty Conservation Institute is a private international research institute dedicated to advancing conservation practice throughout the world. The Getty Conservation Institute, or the GCI as we call it, has been around since 1987. And for most of those 30 years, it has been working in very traditional fields within the conservation world. We work in the Mediterranean world, conserving classical mosaics, or we've been working in the Valley of the Kings, conserving the tomb of King Tut, or the Valley of the Queens. We're about to start on Nefertari's tomb. We've been working in China, conserving wall paintings in Dunhuang. So they've had a long track record of a very sort of traditional approach to conservation and really looking at antiquities. And this conservation of modern architecture is a fairly new idea then for the Getty. It's a bit of a divergence from the more traditional approach, and therefore it's new, and a lot of people are still wondering why we're doing it. So I'm going to answer some of those questions. The reason that we're looking at modernism and the reason that it's a sort of a separate initiative is because modern heritage has its own particular sets of issues. And I'm going to describe those. First of all, there's the issue of quantity. There's lots and lots of modern architecture, and all around the world. In the United States, it said that 85% of the buildings in the US were built after the Second World War, so post 1945. That's a lot of buildings. And these modern buildings also are of a scale that was never known before: vast housing estates and skyscrapers and airports and buildings that didn't even exist in the 19th century. And so there's something about not only the amount of modern architecture, but the scale that makes us realize that we need to understand how to deal with these buildings as they get older, and because they have their own set of issues. They have technical challenges. Many times the modern structures were experimental, either in their construction techniques or in the materials that were used. Frequently we see these composite structural systems like reinforced concrete or brick reinforced with steel. They pose their own challenges, and we find that there are limited repair techniques, and there isn't a very a robust industry that knows how to deal with these kind of issues when it comes time to repair buildings from this era. Mostly when I'm speaking about modern architecture, I'm talking about works from the 1920s through the 1970s. That's a sort of broad category. Maybe goes later in some countries, and I mean in the U.S. we had a little bit of modernism in the mid-20s. In Europe, it started earlier, but this is generally the period that I'm talking about, that we now call the modern era. And one of the things about modern buildings is that they have a different lifespan than traditional buildings. This writer named Thomas Thorne had done a study. He was a British writer. He'd done a study of these traditional, mortar and stone houses and or buildings of any type. It came up with this rule of thumb that every building needed, of these traditional buildings, they needed their first major renovation after about 120 years. And so there was this cycle of repair, that could be pretty much anticipated. These old buildings are durable and they're dependable, and they tend to last. In the case of modern architecture, we can't really quantify what the lifespan is. It certainly isn't 120 years. I was out at the IIM this morning, where they've just completed a very major renovation of their library, and they're going to then move on to the administration block. They've spent some 2.3 million rupees on this building, it was built in 1974. It isn't even 50 years old, and it's already had to have a significant major renovation. So this is what we're up against when we're looking at the way modern materials age, the way these composite systems deteriorate. So it can be quite a problem. I know that you're addressing that very problem here at CEPT. There are other challenges. One of them is the specificity of these forms. You've probably heard this modern adage, form follows function, and in a lot of buildings from the modern era, they were purpose-built. They were built to be airplane terminals or train sheds or something, and it's very difficult to modify these buildings. In the slides I'm showing, the building at the top was the TWA terminal at JFK Airport in New York by Aero Saarinen. The one in the middle is an office building by Frank Lloyd Wright, and the one at the bottom is the Prentice Hospital in Chicago. The Prentice Hospital was torn down because they said it is impossible to renovate it because it's this very strange cloverleaf plan. So there's modern buildings, and in fact, the nice story about the TWA terminal, it could no longer serve as an airplane terminal because the technology of, air travel has changed so much, but it was designated as a landmark in New York, and they turned it into the hotel lobby, and then they built hotel rooms around it, and now it's been reborn as an airport hotel. And so these buildings are extremely challenging, or they can be. It takes a lot of ingenuity sometimes to figure out how to save a building like this and reuse it. So with all of these challenges, the Getty decided to launch this Conserving Modern Architecture initiative. Their first step was we assembled a symposium of experts, people working around the world in this field, people from organizations like Docomomo or ICOMOS 20th Century, people who've been in this practice and specialize. And we basically asked them, where are the gaps in this field? You as a practitioner, and we're focusing on architects and conservators who are out there doing the work. We asked them, what are the gaps that we could fill? How could we be useful to provide information that you need? And from this originating symposium, we developed these 4 pillars, we call them, which is scientific research, model field projects, education and training, dissemination of resources, and public programming. And so this is what the CMAI is all about, and we're trying to do something in each of these areas. The CMAI was launched in 2012, so it's now been 7 years. So we have a few things to talk about that we've actually completed since then, but we're by no means finished. It's sort of it's a big and challenging undertaking that we've committed to. We have these field projects where we partner with a building owner and we provide technical expertise. We don't do construction projects or fund the projects, but we provide our expertise in an attempt to do useful work that we can then share with other people that they can learn from. Our field projects have been the Eames House in California and the Salk Institute for Biological Studies by Louis Kahn, which is in San Diego, California. And then just recently, the Chandigarh Government Art Museum. The project was just launched last week, which is why I'm in India for that. I'll talk about all of those. First, the Eames House. That's been our longest running field project. We started working with the Eames Foundation in 2012. Now, the Eames House is the house of Charles and Ray Eames. Charles died in 1978, and Ray, his wife, died in 88, and it's been turned into a house museum. You may know that Charles and Ray Eames have a connection to Ahmedabad. They were invited by Nehru to come to India to develop concepts for the National Institute for Design, and they stayed here in Ahmedabad, and they traveled extensively in India, and at the end of this stay here, they wrote this thing called the India Report, which was very useful in forming the design school. And they brought a lot of things back from India with them. They traveled, they were, I think, quite influenced by India. So the house is a kind of a testament to them. It's open to the public, and it's pretty much left just as they had. You see this photograph taken in the 50s. This is a steel house. I'll change slides here. It's a steel and glass house. It was very innovative at the time. They were attempting to solve a housing shortage with a low-cost solution, which is using what were basically factory components. But no one had ever really put steel and glass like this together as a residential design before. And it's quite a fragile house, actually. So they came to us and they asked us if we could provide them with some assistance. And so over the years, we've been helping them on various things. They're a family organization, so they don't have a lot of expertise in this field. And so we began by doing some scientific investigations. We did some paint analysis. In a building like this, which is so minimal, the colors are really very important, and there was quite a bit of discussion about whether these black steel pieces were originally black, and we felt it was important to do color studies and do a paint stratigraphy and sort of attach a chronology to these layers of paint so we could understand when they were applied. We did some work on an interior wood lining and to identify the wood species, and there was staining, and we were able to clean it and help them with that. We did an environmental monitoring project very similar to what I'm about to tell you about. In Chandigarh, we set up monitors for temperature, humidity. We looked at UV and visible light and pollution and insects, and we monitored the house for several years and then came up with a report to recommend how they could make changes to the house. It was designed with a very typical residential heating system, and now it's a museum, and the things that they had in their house, which were just their everyday objects, although they had some very nice everyday objects, and they had collections of art and things. This is now considered a museum collection. So it needs to be taken care of at a slightly higher standard, and a lot of the things in this collection are very fragile. I'll talk a bit more about that. So we also did a number of things related to the site. We did a landscape survey. We looked at the condition of the trees. We did a geotechnical report, the improvements plan I just mentioned, and we're working on the exterior paneling system. This is a product called Semesto. This is one of these experimental 20th century materials I mentioned. It's a sandwich board. It's about 1 inch thick with a cement asbestos layer and some fiber board on the middle. And they used it to fill in sections of this window wall system wherever they wanted an opaque wall. In the US and in a lot of places, asbestos is now banned. So this is no longer made. And people think it's highly toxic and are very afraid of it. It's not hazardous in this condition. It's actually in fairly good condition, but it isn't made anymore. So we're trying to see if there are some replacement materials, and we're trying to develop treatment strategies to repair this material and try to consolidate the interior core, because if we can, we want to preserve as much of it as possible. And so when I get back, we're gonna do some consolidant testing and so forth, and do some field trials and try to find a good solution. This is one of these products that is used extensively, and nobody has really done any research about what you do about this. And it's better if we can just leave it and repair it than replace it. So that's our goal. The biggest single thing that we've done for the Eames House is we've written a conservation management plan that we published in January of 2019 after many years. And the Getty is a very big proponent of conservation management plans. I'm happy to see you're doing one here for CEPT. It is a sort of a methodology and a document type that isn't that common in the US, it's very common in Australia, common in England, sort of based on the borough charter in a way. The methodology that it uses is based on the borough charter. So the Getty is a big proponent of this type of this methodology, and the conservation management plan is a tool that the building owners can use for making decisions. As you see here, this is the table of contents. It does a very thorough historical review. It assesses the condition of the building. It compares it with other buildings of its time, and all of this is done in order to develop an understanding of what's significant about it. And then after its significance has been identified, these conservation policies are developed in order to support the significance that we've identified. And so I'm going to talk a bit about this, and I have actually brought a copy of this with me, which I gave to Professor Desai, so maybe you'll put that in the conservation library or something like that. One of the things about the Eames House that we realized when we started working on it is it isn't just a building, but it's a building in a landscape with a collection inside it. And this building had already been listed as a national landmark in the US, but and it had been listed as a Los Angeles monument, but everybody just looked at it as a piece of architecture. And because of the sort of fame of Charles and Ray Eames, you know, the association with them and the architecture was all that people really identified. And we realized that that wasn't the full story at all. The house was sitting on a large parcel that looked out over the Pacific with a row of eucalyptus trees that predated the house, with an open meadow. And that was a very important part of the house. And the things that were inside the house were equally important. They were avid collectors. They traveled, as I mentioned. They had works of art. They had works of their own furniture and their own textiles in the house. And so everything within the house was just as important in a way. If those things were not in the house would lose a huge amount of its character and its association with the two of them. So we felt that we had to look at these three things, and we identified these three things as the sort of the underpinning of what made the building significant. So we looked at the building complex. There are two separate, let's see here. There's the residence here, and then there's the studio with the central courtyard and open space. So even the outdoor space associated with the building were part of the architecture and had a sort of character. And you can see in this picture the courtyard, the planted courtyard with the paving, all of those things were part of it. So just to say this is a work of architecture, we thought that was a very short-sighted approach, and it needed to be expanded. And then the building sits on this sort of wedge-shaped site up on a bluff. It has these landscape elements like this wooden pathway and this row of trees and this open meadow, and all of these landscape features are just as important and in defining the significance of the place. And then, as I said, the contents of the house is a really interesting collection of personal items and their design work. And we felt it was vital to identify this as part of the CMP. And then, so the way the CMP policies work, as I say, they are geared to the significance so that the policies will guide the Eames Foundation or whoever is managing the place. They have very general topics like governance and implementation planning and maintenance and just basic things to guide the organization. And then we provide very detailed policies as well. And in the detailed policies, we go into roof and drainage repair and reinforced concrete slabs and all of the different materials and elements that make up the building. And there are detailed policies for maintaining the collection and detailed policies for managing the landscape. So as I said, this I brought a copy of this and have a look if you're interested. And then all of the scientific reports that we did have been published, and we put everything online on our website. I mentioned that one of the pillars was dissemination. So whenever we do a project, we don't do it just for the benefit of the Eames Foundation, but we try to publish these things and make our work available so that other people can learn from it. I mean, our feeling is that we have the advantage of doing projects in a way that can produce good learnings and lessons for other people. And so we try our best to make these available. There's a lot of material on our website that you can download, and such as the Eames CMP, that's a PDF that you can download if you want to see it. So the second field project that we did was the Salk Institute for Biological Studies by Louis Kahn, who was also the architect of the IIM here. There's some similarities in terms of the way the buildings are massed, although this is a building made of reinforced concrete and teak. So they came, the Salk Institute is a scientific research institute, and they came to us asking for help with preservation of the teak. And these window walls are a key part of the architecture, and they had been badly stained. There was a black biofilm growing on them, and they were deteriorating, and they had been, this black biofilm developed very early on, and Louis Kahn didn't want to put any kind of a sealant or treatment, and this dark film appeared, and the weathering was happening irregularly, and Jonas Salk, who was the head of this center, didn't like that, and they started putting stains and coatings, and then they would fail, and they had a funny orange appearance. And anyway, after about 40 years, the teak looked pretty terrible, and the Institute wanted to just throw it all away. We just have to replace all this teak, and they wanted us to, actually, I think they came to us and said, do you know a place where we can get old growth teak or reclaimed teak or something? And we said, wait a minute, let's see if we can preserve what's here. And I mean, teak is an endangered wood, and it isn't that easy to just replace. So we did about a year's worth of testing to discover what it was. The biofilm was caused by eucalyptus trees nearby. It wasn't actually damaging the wood, we determined, but it was unsightly. It was creating this black staining. We figured out how it could be cleaned. We tested a number of coatings, clear coatings that could be applied. And we looked at the original drawings, realized some of the detailing had been changed on site at the last minute, so the building wasn't doing a very good job of shedding water. It actually had termites had gotten into this wooden assembly, into the softwood behind the teak. So we developed a series of recommendations for them to make repairs, and in the end, they were able to keep 75% of the original teak and only had to discard 25% of it. And in the process, we taught them something about our conservation ethic and our conservation methodology. And I mean, to us, people like me who are architects who love modern architecture, that is an icon of architecture. And they knew that. Like, they knew there were always architects coming to see the building, but they didn't really understand that meant something about the way they should take care of it. And I think we feel like, in addition to solving the teak problem, we shared some important lesson with them about taking care of the building. And there again, if you're interested in very technical things and looking at slides of a wood under a microscope, this is online. This is there's phase 1 and a phase 2. These are the project reports that talk about this work that we did. So the third project is one fairly close to us. It's in Chandigarh in the state of Punjab. And I've just returned from, I was just there for a week, and we're doing an environmental analysis similar to what we did at the Eames House. So this is a museum by Le Corbusier that contains a very important collection. And the collection is very linked with the story of the founding of Chandigarh when the partition happened and the state of Punjab was sort of split between Pakistan and India. There was a very important museum in Lahore that was one of the 5, I think there were like 5 museums that the British had established, and it contained a very important collection. So they actually split the collection too, and 60% of it stayed in Lahore and 40% of it came here. And when Le Corbusier was designing this building, he didn't know that this was going to be happening. I mean, no one knew that the partition would. No, he did know about the partition, but the collection, it took a while to get here, and he thought he was just sort of designing an art museum. And I'll talk a bit about this museum because it's quite an interesting piece of architecture as well. But the building dates from 1968, and it holds this collection, which includes important Indian miniatures from the Pahari region. It includes Gandhara sculptures from northern Pakistan, and it has a very important collection of historic coins as well, and some textiles. So important collection, important building, and the Chandigarh Government Museum received a grant from the Getty Foundation to do a CMP, and we decided we would work with them to develop this environmental piece because the building doesn't work very well. It was designed with the sort of open, if you know the Sanskar Kendra, which I'll talk about in a minute, this is the sister museum. It has a central courtyard, it's raised on piloti, and over the years they've made a lot of changes. It's a beautiful museum, but it was more or less designed to be naturally ventilated, and it's lit from above by these monitors that allow light coming in to light the gallery spaces. But over the years, they've air-conditioned parts of it, and they have closed. There are these vertical aerators that were designed to let wind and cool breezes in. They've closed those because of an early theft problem that made them extremely security conscious. So they've made changes to it over the years that have actually prevented this sort of natural ventilation. And I don't know that Le Corbusier was always successful when he tried to design these things, but he tried. I mean, he thought about the climate. I don't think he completely understood it, but he had an intention that the building could be cooled in the summer by natural breezes, and now it doesn't work at all, and apparently it gets so hot that people don't even come to the museum at all in August. And so we're going to look at, we've set up temperature, relative humidity monitors throughout the building. We're monitoring UV and visible light. We've got a pollution monitor inside the building. We put a weather station on the top of the building and these little coupons inside the display cases. So we're going to try to understand over the course of a full year how the building behaves in the climate that it has. And we're going to try to make suggestions for improving that to the benefit of both the collection and to the people who visit and to the people who work there. So it's a combination of looking at the collection and the architecture and trying to come up with solutions that will hopefully be able to reinstate some of the original principles of this building and also protect the collection. There's a very interesting element to this building. I should go back. Wait, no, the next one. As I said, Le Corbusier didn't know what the collection was going to be, and they wanted an art museum in Chandigarh, and Sector 10 was the cultural sector, so he designed this museum. And it wasn't until after he died accidentally in 1964 that they solidified that they would get this Lahore collection. And every room is a sort of the same, very tall space, and yet they're displaying these Indian miniatures, which are quite intimate scenes that you have to get very close to. So they hired an Italian-Indian designer named Ratna Fabri, and she designed this casework, and it's actually quite beautiful, and we think it is an element of significance for the building. I mean, there's the Le Corbusier architecture, there's the collection, but there's also this display. Now, some of them aren't working very well, but we're going to try to see how we can keep some of this. Some of it is really quite beautiful. She was trying to create more intimate spaces and display the sculptures in the round so people could see them. And so that's another aspect of this museum that we consider to be significant. Okay, so in terms of research, we're doing research on concrete, and that's our big focus right now. Obviously, concrete is one of the building blocks of the modern era. You have issues with concrete here. Everybody has issues with concrete. And some of the research that we've just started is to look at patch repairs that have been done over the past 25 years. People have been repairing concrete for the last 25 years, but nobody has ever actually gone back to look at the efficacy of those repairs to make a determination about what works and what doesn't. So we're working with a partner in the Heritage, Historic England, and this laboratory in France, and some partners in the US. There will be 10 case study sites picked in each of the 3 countries, so there'll be 30 sites, and we'll analyze with this criteria that we developed how these different types of patch repairs have worked, and hopefully come up with some results that will guide us to doing a better job in the future. And then the next phase of this is we're going to look at these mortar formulations that are used for patching. Companies sell these products, and sometimes they're these proprietary products, and you don't exactly know what they are, and they're purported to be the perfect solution for every problem, and we're going to do some analysis about commonly used repair products. In addition, we're writing something called Concrete Conservation Principles, which will be a simple set of a guide, like a 2 or 3 page document that will help people understand how to do concrete repair from what we feel is like the best practices that we've observed. This is a peer-reviewed document that we're hoping to the peer review has been done, and we're hoping to print it by the end of this year. So this should just be a sort of handy guide to people who are in a situation where you're about to do some concrete conservation, and there's some basic principles. I see that you have already received a copy of this concrete book. We're also doing a series of case study books, and each volume of the case study book is going to be a different topic that will be of interest to people in the conservation field. The first topic that we chose was concrete, as I said, basic building block, and an area where we've definitely heard that people want to learn about. This building contains 14 case studies from different places around the world that shows different solutions to common problems. The next one is the one that I'm working on. It's energy and climate management in modern buildings. In my view, that's a problem that we hear all the time. People struggle to make modern buildings energy efficient, to keep them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. They don't meet energy codes that we currently have. Oftentimes, they're sometimes viewed as being energy wasters, and we've assembled actually 10 case studies of projects where we feel that people have done a good job of upgrading the mechanical systems, improving the temperature for the occupants, but also done it within the framework of good conservation practice, so it doesn't ruin the building and it maintains important aspects of the building. So for the future, this case study series will cover topics like conservation planning and adaptive reuse. We may do another concrete volume. modern houses. We're thinking about plastics, and so on. So this is our idea. We'd love to hear ideas about what you think, where we could be useful and provide case study books. It was definitely, we often hear that case studies are in demand. Academics like case studies because they can use them for coursework, and people in the field like to see what their peers are doing. So case studies are very useful, and that's what we're going to focus on. In terms of other publications, we do a lot of bibliographies, and we've done 2 already, one on concrete, readings on concrete, and one on modern materials. And these bibliographies are an attempt also to sort of package information. We feel like in the age of Google and the internet, you can find lots and lots of information about technical topics. But we've tried to sort of curate things and make sure that these readings are good and they're not ridiculous or far-fetched or possibly even damaging practices. So we're trying to put forward things that we think will be useful. And there again, there's utility to academics and to researchers for this kind of information. And finally, we're going to do a little bit of work in the near future on architectural plastics. This is an area that hasn't seen much research, but it's a big, modern buildings contain a lot of plastics, mostly as surface finishes, but there's plastic everywhere, and it's not a popular topic. At the Getty Conservation Institute, we've been looking at conserving plastics in art. Like artists from the 60s and 70s were using plastics and acrylics and all of these things. So we're going to apply a little bit of that science to plastic laminates and plastics that are used in architecture. So that's an upcoming area of research. And finally, I just wanted to talk about what brings me to Ahmedabad. As I said, we have a project in Chandigarh, but this is actually, I think, our 3rd visit to Ahmedabad. And, we were interested in Chandigarh for the obvious reason that it has this sort of modern pedigree, but so does Ahmedabad. And we feel like there's an amazing modern heritage here, not only in the works of Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, but in the works by B.V. Doshi and Charles Correa. And we're very interested in what's happening in efforts to conserve places here in Chandigarh. And in 2018, we were here. We did a panel or a workshop. As I mentioned, Le Corbusier designed only 3 museums in his lifetime, and they're all more or less the same building. 2 of them are here in India, and 1 of them is in Tokyo. And he had this concept for the Museum of Unlimited Growth. It has the central courtyard and some idea that you could expand it. That never happened in any of the cases, but it's interesting because to see this sort of same building appear in 3 completely different contexts is quite interesting. So we brought together representatives from these 3 museums. We spent 3 days in Ahmedabad, and then we went up to Chandigarh. And well, we wanted to introduce the people to each other, and we wanted to have them share their challenges, because in fact, they do face many of the same challenges because they're dealing with a very similar building. And yet they are all very different. The museum in the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo is like a well-funded, expensively maintained museum with a collection of artwork on canvas. It's very popular. They've expanded it 3 times, I think, since it was originally built. And the museum in Chandigarh is, as I described, it's a building in good condition with a very good collection. It has a very small curatorial staff, and They want to do the right thing, and they're reaching out and trying to get help. And then there's the Sanskar Kendra here, which is in poor condition and doesn't really have a very interesting collection, and it has quite low visitation. So as much as we wanted the three museums to kind of get to know each other, we also wanted to sort of demonstrate to the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation or the people working at the running the museum the sort of possibility that that building could have by looking at the two others. And the director, we had a really nice moment. The director of the National Museum in Tokyo, Mr. Murakami, after the first day we met here in Ahmedabad, we visited Sanskar Kendra, and we were asking everybody what were their reactions today. He said, I felt like I've just met a brother I never knew I had, or something like that. I mean, the buildings are so similar that there's a family resemblance, you could say. We wanted them to discuss their issues. We wanted to talk about what's individually significant, but we also had this notion that the three together have some sort of collective significance, that in fact the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. These three create an ensemble of buildings that should be looked at together, and that actually the Sanskar Kendra is part of something bigger than itself, and all three of them are interrelated. So, and we talked a lot about of these things. So, you know, we're quite concerned about the museum here. We talked about the significance we identified significance for Sanskar Kendra. We talked about it being one of 5 of Le Corbusier's buildings here in Ahmedabad, one of the 3 only museums that he ever designed. Its links to the history of the city. It was considered to be the city museum at this moment, 1953, when Ahmedabad was becoming the modern city that it is today. This was meant to be a cultural center for the city. And it has very high integrity. It has been changed very little of all 3 museums. It hasn't been changed hardly at all. And so it is actually quite authentic. And on the other hand, it has some fairly serious vulnerabilities as well. It has a low visitation. It has a very degraded landscape surrounding it. And the mission of the museum is unclear. There's very little staff working there. And the collections are, at least in 2018 when we were here, they were quite worn out. And they didn't seem to be engaging the public at all. They had a very low visitation, very little footfall, as we say. We noticed exterior concrete elements were deteriorating. An incompatible use had been added. At some point, an election office had been added, and the toilets the plumbing was seeping into the concrete and all. So this project is, I would say, is somewhat imperiled. And so we are continuing to be worried about it. And then the other, we held this 3-day workshop of ours at the Mill Owners Building, which is another building that we're quite worried about. This building has a great deal of significance, similar to the other one. It's one of the 5 buildings by Le Corbusier. And it is a symbol of the Ahmedabad's textile history and the philanthropic mission that the mill owners, their history of philanthropy and the organization and what it meant to the city. It's been influential on Indian architecture and on the associations with Indian architects. I should have said, so does Sanskar Kendra. B.V. Doshi worked on that project, and he worked on this project. He was in Le Corbusier's office, as you know. And it has its own history and associations. So we feel it is a very important building, but we feel it has extremely high number of threats that make it perhaps even at a higher risk than the Sanskar Kendra. There are only 4 mill owners remaining in this association that owns the building. There used to be 64 mill owners, and obviously that's a result of the changing economic conditions and the changing roles of the mills, but They don't have sufficient operating funds. We've been working with the general secretary who runs the place, and he tells us that he's trying to rent the space for exhibits and events and so forth, and he's made a contact with architecture schools, and things are happening there, but they're not getting enough funding. But the real threat is from the surrounding, from development and real estate pressures. It's a small property. It's a small building on a large parcel in an area of Ahmedabad that's being developed very rapidly. There are very tall buildings going up all around it, and it's fairly likely, or it's possible, that the site would be sold because the land is so valuable, and it's not protected. None of these modern buildings are protected in any way. So I just point this out because it isn't really something that GCI can solve. This is a local issue, and preservation and conservation has this component. We talk a lot about the technical components and the materiality of buildings, but this is also an important component of conservation, are these issues where you have to sometimes get vocal and make a lot of noise and try to save buildings. And it's not something that we as outsiders can do. And I know it's a very difficult task, but we are worried about especially these two buildings. But we acknowledge the modern heritage in Ahmedabad, this campus, the IIM, and the building. All of the work of Le Corbusier makes it a pretty amazing place, and we would hate to see these buildings lost. And actually, I visited the mill owners yesterday. It looks better than ever, and it's not an issue of material conservation. It's in good shape. It doesn't appear to have any problems, but it is absolutely threatened, I would say, as much as Sanskar Kendra. So that's the end. I have a summary of all these things that we've done just for the sake of boasting. But we're not doing this to boast. We're doing it to try to provide some assistance. And please look at the website and some of these publications, and hopefully you'll find useful information that will help you as you are in your studies, and also as you move into the profession and practicing. We're hopeful this will be good information that you can use. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. The presentation brought to light GCI's initiatives in conservation of modern heritage. Modern architecture constitutes a high proportion of the built environment. The PPT also discussed the technical challenges the buildings face in terms of construction techniques, structural issues during their lifespan, and it also brought to light the future case studies in conservation management and the future publications they intend to take. So this was quite in line with the lecture previously arranged by Chitkara, by Dr. Amit Mittal, which was also a line in the direction that how do you take up technical publications, and whatever work we do in the field of conservation is published in scientific journals, and it becomes a repository for all others. With this, we now move on to the next session. We have Dr. Rohit Jigyasu with us. He's an eminent conservation architect and risk management professional from India, currently working at ICCROM as project manager on urban heritage, climate change, and disaster risk management. Dr. Rohit served as UNESCO Chairholder Professor at the Institute for Disaster Mitigation of Urban Cultural Heritage at Ritsumeikan University, Kyoto, Japan, where he was instrumental in developing and teaching international training course on disaster risk management of cultural heritage. Sir was the elected president of ICOMOS India for the term 2014 to 2018, and also served as president of ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness from 2010 to 2019. Sir served as elected member of the Executive Committee of ICOMOS since 2011 and was its Vice President from 2017 to 20. Before joining ICCROM, Sir has been working with several national and international organizations such as UNESCO, UNISTR, Getty Conservation, and World Bank for consultancy, research, and training on disaster risk management of cultural heritage. Sir is an international figure that does not need any introduction, actually. Sir will be talking about ICCROM's initiatives on conserving modern heritage today. And before we move on to your session, sir, I have something very interesting to show you. We promoted a postcard making competition among our students. So this is the outcome of that. They have made small postcards and we've got these printed. They're all handmade. This was to promote heritage awareness. So this was done on the theme of heritage this year. And this is the World Heritage Site of Hawa Mahal, Jaipur, from the walled city of Jaipur. And the Sun Temple, Konark. I hope it's visible. Can we zoom it a little? So we have printed the name of the student as well. And this is what we're going to circulate in our university for all the departments promoting heritage awareness about the UNESCO sites. These are the Mountain Railways of India, the Darjeeling Heritage Site. So this is done by our students. Over to you, sir, for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhandari. Fantastic initiative by the students. I must congratulate the students and the faculty for such a inspiring initiative. I think this is to be followed by all the institutions, and I'm sure we are going to get many more young professionals who would like to take up heritage conservation as their area of interest, which is what we need. So again, thank you to the organizers, to Chitkara University, and especially to you and Dr. Bansal for inviting me over here. Let me start my presentation, which is going to be very brief because I would like to just highlight key issues and key initiatives that at ICCROM we are initiating right now. I'll just try to share the screen now. So yes, here we are. If you just kindly confirm if the screen is visible.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much. So let's start with the challenge with modern heritage that we have in India and around the world. And this is an iconic example of an iconic modern heritage building which suffered demolition a couple of years ago. Famous building, Hall of Nations, designed by and constructed by Raj Rival. And it kind of brought out this very important issue of what is the importance of modern heritage, and not just for professionals, because as heritage professionals, we are all probably aware of the significance. We are all, we really want to do something about this. But what about the larger public? What about the larger decision maker fraternity? Those who are in charge of making policies, decisions at the government level, how much are they really, how much are they aware of the significance of this heritage, or do they really recognize that it is worthy of protection? So this issue really came out very strongly with this incident. But this is not an issue which is limited only to developing countries like India. I think this is an issue which is global. And very recently, just I'm showing another example from India, which is in Ahmedabad, Kanika Dome, which was designed in 1963, and a very unique example of a geodesic dome, which was inspired by Buckminster Fuller's design. And again, it suffered a lot of damage. Especially during the earthquake in 2001, part of it collapsed. And at this moment, even though it is recognized as a structure worthy of protection, the condition of this is not really in a good state, and maybe we will lose it soon. So this is the kind of challenge we have with modern heritage in India. But as I said, this is not something that is restricted to developing countries. There are plenty of examples from well-developed countries where we may expect that there is a good recognition of modern heritage, but is not so. And this is just what happened a couple of months ago in Japan. In March this year, this very, very interesting and very significant modern heritage building, which is Nakagin Capsule Hotel, designed by Kisho Kurokawa, a very important architect and a very unique design, was actually demolished. In spite of a lot of protests, in spite of petitions, nothing worked, and this building has been demolished, and now a new structure, ultra modern, which is kind of being going to be all in maybe postmodern style, is going to be taking the place of this important modern heritage structure. So what are the challenges that we are concerned about with regards to modern heritage conservation? Let's start with these key challenges, which I think have to determine where we move from here. What we need to do both at the professional level and also at the community awareness or larger advocacy level. What are those things that we need to do have to be determined by these specific challenges. In my view, the first major challenge that we have is how do we establish the significance of modern heritage, considering that it is the most recent heritage and has different points of reference in different geographical contexts. In a country like India, where we have ancient heritage thousands of years old, this is the first question that comes up. Why we talk about modern heritage? Why is it important when we have so much more to take care of? And then the argument that is given is that we have limited resources and we are talking about something so recent, while we should really prioritize heritage, which is kind of old, in terms of age. So this is definitely an important area where we need to work on. How do we convincingly establish significance of modern heritage, explain it not only to our professional fraternity, but beyond it, to the decision makers, so that they understand why it requires protection and management. And as I said, the second connected point is that modern heritage in India or in Thailand or in, let's say, in any country in Europe or in Africa would be very different, because how modernism is defined in any particular geographical context is going to be very different. It cannot be done in the same, with the same reference point. Industrial revolution came in Europe at a certain point of time and was associated with modern heritage, but it might not be the case in other parts of the world. So we need to also be very clear in determining what is going to be the reference point for, or what would be the scope of defining modern heritage in different contexts. And that requires a lot of historical analysis, a lot of analysis which is comparative in nature, and that will have to be taken up through a lot of research in this domain. The second point, which I feel is really critical now, we are all talking about climate change. We are all worried about what's happening due to climate change. And it is not a guessing game. It's something which is happening today. It's having a huge impact, both in terms of increased temperature and humidity conditions, but also in terms of increased intensity of disasters like flooding or cyclones. And of course, all these are going to have an impact on all kind of heritage, but also will have an impact on modern heritage. And specifically in terms of the deterioration processes of modern materials. And we have already ample evidence to show that this deterioration process is accelerating and is also now changing its scope. Areas where there was not much humidity are now telling us that there is much more humidity conditions there. And obviously those are having an impact on the material, on the reinforcements that are there in concrete. And we are facing with new kind of challenges. And it's important for us that we focus a lot more attention in really understanding these impacts, in analyzing them, doing proper investigations. And again, these have to be done in different geographical contexts, because climate change is not universal. It is having different impacts in different parts of the world. And these have to be analyzed and understood better in order to design our conservation practices accordingly. The third important issue, which I would like to highlight here, is how to convince and work with the owners of modern heritage buildings so as to prevent transformations. It's a huge challenge because, again, because of the widespread perception that modern heritage is recent, it can change. You don't need to, why do you need to protect it, in the sense why do you have to take care of not changing a few things because they are coming from a certain period? We have to work a lot more with the owners of these buildings and it's not going to be easy. It requires us a lot of engagement process, a lot of discussion, a lot of examples and options to be created so that the owners or the clients can really see what options are possible, not compromising on the quality, not compromising on the the opportunities that are available with new technology or new infrastructure, but at the same time, trying to work out a kind of balance between keeping what is of heritage value, but at the same time, including all the kind of necessary changes that are required. The third issue I think we need to work on is about finding sustainable adaptive reuse for modern heritage buildings and integrate concerns for infrastructure upgradation and energy efficiency. We all talk about green buildings. We all talk about, as a sensitive response to climate impacts, to do enough mitigation so as to reduce carbon emissions. We have to be aware of the needs for upgrading our infrastructure to cope up with the new demands and the new needs. But at the same time, we need to provide new uses to these buildings, especially when the old uses for which these were originally designed are no longer viable. So how do we handle this challenge? And again, we need to have plenty of examples, again, in different socioeconomic contexts, because these uses and these upgradations have to be really responsive to the local context. And that's why we need to have much more examples coming from around the world, which demonstrate how this can be achieved, which can show us some good case studies. We are already having some, but we need to have many more. And I think at this end, I would definitely commend what Getty has been doing in terms of their Keeping the Modern program, the kind of grants that have been coming through Getty Foundation. These are really creating those examples, which are going to be really needed in order to really develop, inspire specific examples in different parts of the world. The other issue I want to highlight is really about risk approach, which I personally really believe in. We have been dealing with conservation in a very reactive mode for a long time, where we have been really focusing on repairing what has been already damaged or the deteriorations that have already happened. How do we fix them? So we have been very much concerned about that, and rightfully so. But it is high time now that we try to be proactive. We try to address the risks that are going to happen in the future. And this is going to be more important because the changes that are going to happen in the future are exponential for many reasons, including climate change, but also urbanization and other kind of factors, which are kind of history doesn't tell us that they have been happening at the same pace as they are expected to happen in the future, especially in many parts of the developing world. So we really need to now focus a lot more on a risk approach, which is really going to give us solutions which are helpful in preventing these risks or mitigating these risks. which we call, of course, as preventive conservation. And we need to develop a lot more techniques, methodologies, tools that can help us do this. And lastly, I feel that we need to have many more guidelines, standards, and methodologies to guide professionals into this process. Again, these guidelines have to be again tailored to local contexts, have to be also undertaken sometimes at different scales. These guidelines might be good for professionals at a higher level, but we need to also develop some simple do's and don'ts for those who work at the site, maybe in the local languages. Maybe we don't know, they will not know English, and we can't expect them to really be able to follow these guidelines, which are kind of written in a more professional, a more technical way. So I think we need to really work a lot in scaling down. First of all, of course, developing those guidelines, standards, and methodologies, but also scaling them down to where they will actually matter in terms of implementation in practice. So I wanted to kind of highlight these challenges and just mention this risk approach really has to be seen with regards to all these different agents which can have an impact on the materials that constitute modern heritage. And these will be, of course, having impacts on other materials and other kind of structures, but we need to be very specific in terms of their particular impact on modern materials. And when I say modern materials, I'm not only talking about concrete. There are many, many different compositions or types of modern materials used. Sometimes by themselves, but sometimes in combination. And we also need to kind of see how these materials work together with each other. Steel in relation to concrete, or terrazzo, which is another unique kind of material. So we need to kind of also, or conglomerate flooring, or other kind of, so we need to create a vocabulary of modern heritage, the materials used in modern heritage, again in different parts of the world, and try and understand and analyze how these different agents are going to have a specific impact on them, and accordingly work out preventive conservation measures. So now I'm going towards the kind of the last part of my presentation, and I want to highlight that there have been a lot of international initiatives. I mean, I would say, like, from 1990 onwards, now we have 22 years since DOCOMO started having with the first international conference, and Eindhoven statement was one of the pioneering statements, I would say. And then from 2001, when UNESCO World Heritage Center, ICOMOS, and DOCOMO launched a joint program for the preservation of modern architecture. And then moving on, in 2005, a very important landmark kind of initiative took place in ICOMOS when ISC 20th Century Committee was established. And this committee has been doing excellent work. We all know about the kind of guidelines that they have been formulating, the kind of benchmarks they have been setting. I remember here my good friend Shayden Book, from Australia, who has been working extensively in this area for ICOMOS 20th Century and has contributed immensely. And not only her, but many more. And I remember the contribution they also made during the Journal Assembly that we had in Delhi in 2017. So I think this is definitely one of the important, I would say, landmark starting point for modern heritage movement with this ISC 20th Century. And coming to, we have my good friend from Getty here. And you know what Getty has been doing, and we have been all learning about the Getty's initiative. So I won't talk about it here, but I just want to acknowledge the kind of work that they have been doing, I would say particularly since 2012. And then later on with the Keeping in Modern project. Also, Association for Preservation Technology has been working in this area. So there have been a lot of work being done. But there's a lot more to do. And I think the bigger challenge right now is to decentralize this modern heritage movement. We need to go for decentralization. That will be my big plea through this presentation. I don't think we can now continue to look at it as a global thing, because yes, it is a global issue, but the global issue will have to be understood at the local level. And therefore, we need to take this modern heritage movement to a lower level, to a decentralized level, and really try and understand what does it mean in particular social, economic, cultural, and of course, political and institutional context. That's where we need to really take this movement forward. And now I come to what ICOMOS has been working in this area. There have been a couple of initiatives, and I would like to start with an initiative that ICOMOS started in 1999 in collaboration with the National Board of Antiquities of Finland and Alvar Aalto Academy, where international course on the conservation of modern heritage or modern architecture called MARC was initiated. And this course continued every alternate year since till 2011. After 2011, it has been discontinued, but now we are exploring, again with Alvar Aalto Foundation, a possible new initiative, in fact, beginning next year. So we are in discussion and hopefully we'll be able to launch this program again in the coming year. And this program has really created a lot of has given training or capacity building to many young heritage professionals who have been sensitized and have learned the skills and techniques to work with modern architecture. The other important initiative I would like to highlight here, which is being currently undertaken, is Modern Heritage of Africa initiative. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need to decentralize and understand heritage in a more local context. What does modern heritage mean in a local context? And Africa has been now rethinking about modern heritage movement in its own context. And I think this is very important. We have certain heritage sites now even being recognized globally from Africa. One example is Asmara, this modernist city of Africa in Eritrea, which is actually on the World Heritage List now. But of course, Africa is a large continent, and they had their own pace of industrial movement, their own pace of bringing in of new materials and development of new kind of architecture. So Africa is really doing a soul searching and trying to find out what is modern heritage mean for it. And for that, they have launched this initiative in combination with Africa World Heritage Fund, UCL, ICOMOS, IUCN, and of course, ICROM has been part of this initiative. And it intends to support the sustainable agenda in Africa through research, protection, utilization, and reinterpretation of its modern heritage, and to contribute towards improving the implementation of World Heritage Convention in the African continent, specifically pertaining to modern heritage. So I would like to mention this important initiative as well. There was an important conference that took place last year, and another one is proposed this year. So we are now moving forward and taking this initiative much further and engaging with a lot of professionals from Africa to really work in this domain. At ICROM, very recently, in fact, less than a month ago, we organized a webinar, Conserving the Modern Global Initiatives, Local Solutions, where we had professionals from around the world, and we had Dr. Shika Jain, who represented India and presented the Getty project that she has been working on in Gandhi Bhavan. But we also had very interesting presentations from Japan, from United States, from Italy, and all these examples helped us, and also from the Caribbean. And all these examples help us understand that the challenges are very unique in different parts of the world, but of course there are some common challenges as well. We use this as a starting point for us to plan for the next year's international training course on conservation of built heritage. As you know, ICROM has been holding this, has been conducting this international training course called CBH for many years, starting in 1997. but then it got discontinued a couple of years ago. And I'm happy to say that we are restarting it next year in 2023. And one of the things that we are bringing in this new version of CBH is a whole new attention to modern heritage, because I think this has to be integrated with understanding of all the other kind of built heritage. And we will be having specific sessions that are dedicated towards assessment of damages and risks and conservation of modern materials and structures, which we would like to include it as part of our teaching curriculum. So I'm going to conclude here. I hope I have been able to bring out some of the key issues that we have been working with, some of the initiatives that we have started. But as I said, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And it is high time that we take this global movement to the local level and start to develop more localized initiatives, which are responding to the local risks, local needs, and local, I would say, opportunities as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful and informative presentation and sharing with us the initiatives by ICCROM on the conservation of modern heritage. Sir has very well described the challenges concerning modern heritage conservation, and has also pointed out some significant issues like establishing the significance of modern heritage, sustainable adaptive reuse of modern heritage buildings, and methodologies to guide the professionals. The timelines and progress towards the common goal at the global level, the initiatives taken by UNESCO, ICOMOS, DOCOMO, and GCI. Thank you very much, sir, for this informative presentation. As we move closer to the end of this event, I would now invite the members of ICOMOS India Climate Change and Heritage Working Group to present us a summary of COP26 key learnings and their application to 20th century heritage in the Indian context. I would like to introduce the members of this panel, Ms. Shalini Das Gupta. She's a conservation architect based in New Delhi and runs a multidisciplinary practice. She's been a very active member of ICOMOS since 2013 and is currently holding the post of Secretary, ICOMOS India. She's an expert member of ISC documentation, CIPA, and the National Focal Point for the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group. Next, we have Ms. Priyanka Panjwani. She's a conservation architect with 10 years of experience in architecture and regeneration projects. She has been professionally active as a heritage consultant and a visiting academic with esteemed institutions. She is currently working as coordinator of ICOMOS India's NSC on risk preparedness. In 2022, Ms. Priyanka had the honor of being selected among 25 women as part of C40 Cities Women for Climate Mumbai cohort. Ms. Nitya Lakshmi Iyer, a conservation architect with a keen interest in 20th century architecture, material conservation, and adaptive reuse. She's an alumnus of Getty Graduate Internship Program. Over the course of her career, she's had the opportunity to work with multidisciplinary teams in organizations like Center for Architectural Conservation, Art Deco Mumbai Trust, World Monuments Fund on Conservation, to name a few. She is also an associate member and EP representative of ICOMOS ISC 20C. We also have with us Ms. Saranya Darshini, a conservation architect and coordinator for the Heritage and Gender Equality Task Team, a joint task team for ICOMOS UN Agenda Sustainable Development Goals Working Group and Rights-Based Approach Working Group. Through her fellowship at the Living Waters Museum and SPRF, Saranya explored the intersection of climate and heritage, highlighting the importance culture-nature perspective. She's a member of ICOMOS IC 20C, ISC Water and Heritage, ISCCL, and STG-WG. I now invite these members to give an insight and summary of the COP26. Over to you. Happy to have you all on board together.
Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for inviting ICOMOS India Climate Change and Heritage Working Group to this very esteemed and important discussion on rediscovering modern heritage through climate resilience and sustainability, case of Chandigarh and Ahmedabad. Very many thanks to Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture and also Center for Heritage and Conservation, CEPT University. Next slide, please. So in this last session and almost the last talk, we from ICOMOS India Climate Change and Heritage Working Group will be giving a short presentation on the key learnings that took place from the COP26 and their application to the 20th century heritage in the Indian context. Next slide, please. So the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group is dedicated to the discussion and understanding of climate change and its implications on the heritage of the country. And in this group, we are about 30 members, all working conservation professionals. And it is a very nascent national group which was formed in Jan 2020 to support and collaborate the activities of the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group. The total number of members are 29. Yeah, okay. The priorities for the next 2 years for the Climate Change and Heritage Working Group is to develop contacts with relevant government agencies and ministries for capacity building, to develop a white paper and an online directory for climate experts and institutions, to organize monthly knowledge sharing webinars, research on traditional practices, and national and international collaborative activity for urban heritage and climate. Thank you. So for this, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. For this presentation, 3 of us, me, Priyanka, Nitya, and Saranya will be talking briefly on the COP. So my name is Priyanka Panjwani and I'm a conservation architect from Mumbai. In the previous sessions, we have looked at case presentations and conservation processes of modern heritage in India. In this last session on global perspectives, research possibilities and way forward, I will begin with a macro view of the climate change related mechanisms of the United Nations. On this slide is a chronology of mechanisms, terms we often use with respect to climate action, which most of you may be aware of already. So consider it as a memory refresher. To begin with, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a UN body which prepares comprehensive scientific assessment reports about climate change, its causes, potential impacts, and response options. It was in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, that the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed and accepted. Under UNFCCC, the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, was formed, which is a decision-making body that reviews the implementation of the convention. The Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, we see it on the slide, they were accepted in 1997 and 2015 respectively. They are legal treaties adopted in COP sessions. While UNFCCC encouraged industrialized countries to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions, the protocol commits them to do so. And the aim of the Paris Agreement is to keep the global average temperature rise in the century as close possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. For this, it needs countries to submit nationally determined contributions every 5 years. I will speak more on India's NDCs in the next slide. Finally, we have the COP26, which is a 26th session of the parties, which took place last year, and it was hosted by the UK in Glasgow. During this session, nations adopted the Glasgow Climate Pact, aiming to turn the 2020s into a decade of climate action, and they also completed the Paris Agreement's rulebook. Next slide, please. We move our attention to the mechanisms in India at present for climate action. Roughly around the 14th session of the COP in 2008, India launched its own National Action Plan on Climate Change. These are planned to be implemented through the 8 national missions as listed on the left-hand side of the slide. The National Action Plan is coordinated by the Climate Change Division of Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, while the responsibility of the mission rests with the corresponding government ministry. Several states in India consequently have begun to form their own state action plans for climate action. In 2015, the government released its ambitious nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as part of the UNFCCC's Paris Agreement. These NDCs include promoting renewable energies, as well as additional forest cover, enhancing adaptation measures for a sustainable lifestyle, mobilizing finance, and transferring technology. India has not yet submitted its updated 2030 targets. So here also we see that the Climate Action Tracker of the Climate Analytics, a non-profit climate science and policy institute based in Berlin, Germany, it rates India's climate targets as highly insufficient. Next slide, please. Coming back to the COP, there was a pre-COP 26 summit which took place in September with the Youth for Climate Driving Ambition event hosted by the government of Italy in Milan. It brought together some 400 young climate leaders from all over the globe, 2 from each of the 197 member countries of the UNFCCC. Climate Heritage Network, along with ICOMOS's Emerging Professionals Group, organized the Climate Heritage Narratives, youth-led intergenerational dialogues during pre-COP, and these were online conversations under the themes of sustainable heritage tourism, traditional knowledge and skills, and transformative change. In November 2021, the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference took place at the Scottish Event Campus in Glasgow. Typically, the COP included 3 parts: formal negotiations, side events and meetings, and conferences, exhibitions, and demonstrations around the host city. Next slide, please. So the main goals set out for the COP26 were under the heads of mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. It reaffirmed the continuation of key principles from the Paris Agreement and previous COPs, including multilateralism and the importance of nature and biodiversity to climate action. In spite of the strong intent, progress of the convention rests on the weak pillars of goodwill. It is seen that the countries failed to make significant progress on climate finance, and some coal-reliant countries indicated that they will not completely stop using coal until the 2040s or later. During the World Leaders Summit in COP26, Indian Prime Minister Mr. Modi announced the climate change goals, which are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And the goal, the important goal for India with a 2070 net zero target. Experts have said that India's announcement is very ambitious and would require countering emissions from agriculture and land use, and not just emissions from energy and industrial processes. It may be also important to note that most of the goals relate to mitigation and not adaptation. Next slide, please. The COP26 included events and activities in 2 different zones, the blue zone and the green zone. The COP Resilience Hub, which was a physical pavilion in the COP26 Blue Zone, a UN-managed space for negotiations at the Glasgow Caledonian University, with a large virtual platform running 24/7. Its central purpose was to advance action on adaptation and resilience at COP26 and beyond, and to help provide a strong collective voice on resilience. ICOMOS participated in the COP26 with Climate Heritage Network to highlight the engagement of cultural heritage in climate action. I was also a panel chair at one of the Resilience Hub events in the Blue Zone with the Climate Heritage Network Youth Forum. Although topics on traditional heritage, coastal heritage, indigenous communities were discussed in the Resilience Hub, it was no surprise that 20th century heritage was conspicuous in its absence in the conversation. Next slide, please. In the green zone, the UK government created a space for cultural narratives by youth groups, civil society, academia, artists, and business to host events, exhibitions, cultural performances, workshops, and talks. Many of these events are available to view as an exhibition on Google Arts and Culture platform. I now hand over the virtual screen to my colleague Saranya to elaborate on the joint ICOMOS IPCC UNESCO meetings, which took place post the COP in December 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. I hope you can hear me now. I'm just using another device. Thanks, Priyanka, for putting that very efficiently. Next slide, please, Nitya. So moving on from, last year was a very, very busy year with heritage and climate change. The discourse was too vast to even actually put together in such a short presentation. But one of the key or very important event after COP26 that happened was the ICOMOS IPCC UNESCO International Co-Sponsored Meeting on Culture, Heritage and Climate Change. So IPCC is, as Priyanka has already given a briefing of, it's the intergovernmental panel on climate change. So each of these organizations came together for the first time, and this also gave opportunity for all the three organizations and their members to come together. So ICOMOS had this wonderful opportunity where national committees, scientific committees could come, like the members from these committees could be part of the this meeting, and this took place virtually in the month of December. This went on through for a week. Next slide, please. So the agenda, why did this discussion come about and why this meeting was required was to generally to understand, what is the state of knowledge that is existing currently that connects, culture heritage with anthropogenic climate change, to establish a baseline reference regarding, we have been talking about traditional knowledge systems, but to understand what are the existing research that is there in connection to that, and build new conversations and collaborations amongst these three important groups who are actually working within climate change, heritage, and World Heritage Sites. So it was very important that to bring together these three organizations to work on research and action in climate science, adaptation, and mitigation. And also, as I mentioned, it brought together hundreds of researchers and practitioners from all over the world to have these closed door meetings. This happened in Zoom. So it was more like, we had workshops where all three of us were also part of it, Priyanka, Nitya, and me from ICOMOS India as rapporteurs. And we could be part of these engaging conversations to understand how when within these organizations climate change is being discussed, or how heritage and climate change is being connected. The sessions in these meetings were very interestingly divided into a way that eventually throughout the week you are discussing from impacts, understanding where are the impacts and how are these impacts happening, the knowledge systems that we can learn from, and deriving solutions that could be part of this meeting itself. Next slide, please. And bringing to, Priyanka actually pointed out this was something even in pre-COP that, a glaringly obvious absence is when we talk about heritage is 20C. So 20C, we already know, actually, Dr. Jigyasu also mentioned about it, the recognition, most of the sites are still unlisted. Finance plays a very huge role of adapting it, adaptive reuse, how these structures are being used. But this is something also, in a sense, like history repeating itself, because if you go back like 100 years back, how Victorian buildings were treated, we did lose around the world a lot of Victorian buildings, because when maybe there is a shorter gap in the human ingenuity of people not recognizing the importance of technology and the design that it happens in your own time period, that recognition is lacking. And I think that's why 20C also suffers a lot, because we just don't realize that what a wonderful building it is, and it just happened in your lifetime. So that's something, it's just something from the history itself for us to learn from the knowledge system. It's just not how we can preserve it, but also how history and the narrative of buildings and architecture is. And with seeing this Hall of Nations, so many structures that we have lost in 20C itself, one of the key points is the embodied carbon, because we have always been hearing this line of, for the past 10 years, is the greenest building is the one that already exists. So when we are talking about this, and when it's moving towards demolition, it affects, and this is something just a cog in the wheel towards leading towards more accelerated climate change. Next slide, please. To give just an overview of just from the IPCC itself, one of the understanding that I got from it was the conversations around 20C is very lacking, but also the opportunity which 20C will give us is far and wide, because this is the technology and knowledge system that we have in our own lifetime, and we know how concrete works or how it doesn't work, or what kind of structures that have been built. We are very closer to that kind of technology, and maybe the possible solutions that could be found could be something within this time period. And also 20C being one of the type of heritage which is time bound. It's 20th century. That's one of the unique aspects of it, other than the other heritage the way we see. Most importantly is coastal cities. When we are talking about climate heritage and architecture, is there are coastal city. One example is Mumbai here itself. This stretch that the photograph shows is a World Heritage Site, the Art Deco ensemble. And this is something I think is very important when we consider about climate adaptive strategies, that World Heritage Sites and heritage that is already existing are part of major cities and are along the coast. So these are some aspects of it that was missing or not touched upon, but I think it's something within ICOMOS India. There is some larger scope to explore and discuss and talk about, and I think Nitya will take over on that aspect. Over to you, Nitya.
You, Priyanka and Saranya. I'll just follow up on a lot of what they have said. And I think a lot of what I summarize here, some of this might be a repeat from what Dr. Jigyasu already has mentioned. So consider this more like a refresher or a summary of everything that's happened so far. To begin with, let's just step back a little bit and go on to a more global overview of the space. Worldwide, a diverse set of building sites, landscapes and urban settings have been produced in the 20th century. And if you notice on the left-hand side, it's a snapshot of 10 overarching and interconnected phenomena that have been identified as part of this publication by the GCI and in association with the International Scientific Committee of 20th Century. And these phenomena basically are have shaped the built environment of this era worldwide. These themes have also will help us organize our recent past and identify at-risk spaces that may be under-recognized, underappreciated, under threat of development or change. In comparison to the entire past, many more buildings were actually produced in the 20th century. And there are many events that have led to that kind of development and creation. A lot of these have been identified as architectural icons across the globe. And some of these sites enable us to also develop a much more comprehensive understanding of our time, the 20th century, which is very recent. And I believe we relate more closely to that than to any other century before. So it's important to highlight here that this legacy has also directly or indirectly been impacted by the global process of industrialization. So making the conversation around the preservation of these properties extremely relevant within this discourse of climate change and heritage. On the right here, what you'll notice are some examples of structures that are unique to this period. On the top left is the Kenneth Dyke Library, a 1930s Frey-Drew building known as a key work for tropical modernism. On the right is Oscar Niemeyer's Palacio da Alvarado, also known as the Palace of Dawn. Bottom right is the former Vanilla factory that is considered as a prime example of international style. And bottom left is the modernist marvel Miami Marine Stadium that was once considered a highlight of tropical beauty. Now, if we move on from the global to the national, we can look at all the buildings, and if it's broadly classified, especially in India, it was first colonization and later the emergence of the new nation state that led to the creation of most of India's 20th century heritage. On the left, I've actually detailed out some of the regional themes and the associated representative set of building typologies that were constructed in this period. These buildings not only embodied ambitious ideas, social progress, technological advancement, and improved spatial configurations, but they also catered to various functional needs of the time, all while keeping the regional weather in mind. So it is important to note here that, there are 6 distinct climate zones that have been identified in the country. So when you look at that and the fact that these buildings, were designed keeping the regional climate in mind, it's important to remember, and most of this is lost in conversations of 20th century, is that the builders of this period considered daily and seasonal climate patterns when designing facades and fenestrations for these climate responsive designs. On the right here, I have identified a few visual examples. So on the top left and bottom right are images of the iconic grey Soleil facades of Secretariat in Chandigarh's capital complex and in Ahmedabad's Mill Owners Association that deflect sunlight. Right on the top right is India's earliest modernist building, Golconda Ashram, where movable luvers were installed along the common corridors of the building. And on the bottom left is the image of Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, where courtyards and louvered windows were used to help regulate the light and air movement within the building. These are the 3 most significant challenges faced by India's 20th century heritage. First is the lack of appreciation. There's a general lack of awareness and admiration for these climate sensitive buildings. 2, the rate of replacement. Although 20th century structures dominate the built landscape by their sheer number, their resemblance to present day architecture makes these buildings vulnerable to damage. And 3, threat to demolition. The above stated reasons, along with the lack of funding, which Saranya also mentioned, those funding opportunities to conserve and to facilitate future sustainable use leads to flattening of such buildings at an individual and at precinct level, increasing the embodied carbon emission. So finally, here we have some of the opportunities and the way forward for 20th century heritage in terms of climate action, categorized under the 4 verticals that Priyanka so rightly explored in her part of the presentation. So starting under mitigation, we can reduce demolition by protecting these cultural resources, especially to mitigate emissions attributed to urban area, facilitate inclusion of 20C buildings in local heritage inventories to build awareness and enable efficient use of existing building stock, establish institutional framework and policies that promote and incentivize reuse, retrofit, or upgrade of existing buildings, and set up guidelines and standards for adaptation to assist decision makers and stakeholders in selecting relevant intervention. Under adaptations, we can facilitate reprogramming of underutilized spaces, enable reimagining and reconfiguration of overused spaces, and encourage adaptive reuse as a whole, and develop techniques to achieve energy efficiency and thermal comfort. Under finances, we can explore local, national, or transnational financing opportunities and identify public, private, and alternate sources of finance to fund research. Under collaboration, we can promote a multidisciplinary approach as a way forward, encourage further research on ways to arrest the embodied carbon, in heritage buildings, and finally, enable ways of disseminating the relevant research through education and training. Of course, considering this discourse is currently at a nascent stage, I'd like to also leave you with this question and something to ponder, which is, what is the future really of our recent past? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this insightful summary. In fact, I would say a power-packed summary. I have a question. How do you guys manage so much? Thank you for summarizing it for us. And any questions from the audience? I think there are a few points in the chat box. Can we see the chat box, please? Okay, would be considered the Chandigarh College of Architecture established by Sir Le Corbusier in 1961 himself in Chandigarh, a modern heritage infrastructure, as it highlights Corbusier's key design, structural and material elements on a small scale? If you wish to answer the question. And
short answers, yes.
And there is something from architect Poonam Verma that also, I think it was regarding the regional thematic framework. The focus was also on looking at cultural heritage conservation as climate action, and 3 white papers are in process of finalization to take the research forward. Learning is that professionally conservationists have also to scale down and highlight conservation in the larger context of carbon situation, which also led to the realization, and yes, I agree with what she's put forward, along with people's participation has been recognized as one of the keystones. Decolonization of research and availability of data as well as funding is another important accepted point that will be taken up in further to dialogue the bridge. And she says, excellent summary. So thank you very much for this summary. With that,
thank you.
We now move to the last part of today's session. Moving closer to ending the event, we'll now be discussing the key takeaways. So I, on behalf of Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, and Ms. Jayashree Bardhan from the Center of Heritage Conservation, CEPT, would discuss some key takeaways that shall pave the way forward. So Jayashree, are you there?
Yes, Harveen, I'm here.
Over to you, please.
Should I start first?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Okay, it's been a wonderful 2 days. Various speakers have presented their views and thoughts on this idea. We also had guided site visits where students presented their ideas. And we had some very local conversations in local conversations about Chandigarh and Ahmedabad yesterday. Today we saw larger global perspectives. So what I'll do is I'll present some key ideas, some questions. I'm also thinking. So some things I'll put forward for everybody to think about. What I thought was one important thing that came across through all presentations was the significance of modern heritage. And while one is evaluating the significance of modern heritage, it's important to understand that it's not just the fabric, but a lot of intangible aspects. For example, the underlying principles based on which it was built, or the technology that went along with the conservation movement. And that is not the same in all parts of the world. Again, each place will have its own technology associated with 20th century. And without understanding the complete significance, it's, in addition to that, also the context within which this heritage is located. And without understanding the complete significance, it wouldn't be possible to, propose any conservation measures or it would lead to inappropriate conservation measures. So understanding the entire significance in its entirety is extremely important. I think the presentation on Chandigarh that was made, it talked about, Dr. Arman very nicely pointed out conservation measures that have been happening there at different scales. So the larger fenestrations, terraces, concrete as material is being conserved and repaired, but at the same time, the tapestry is being talked about and the furniture is being talked about. So that's again important. At the same time, in Jigna's presentation, Annabelle and Nitya's presentation, we saw that the uses of these places are changing, and how do you accommodate different kinds of uses? All modern heritage places might not have the same solutions, and each place needs its own unique solutions. The second point I thought was, I think Chandler in today's presentation, he talked about caring for heritage. And this somehow ties back to yesterday's discussion between, in the panel presentation between Nitya, Annabelle, Jigna, Riaz, about authorship of buildings versus modern buildings when they have to become heritage. By default, conservation as a process necessitates that a lot of people are involved in it. And today Rohit also mentioned about how we need to engage more with the custodians and owners. And when a lot of people connect with the buildings, only then it's possible for modern buildings or places to become heritage. Yesterday, another point was brought about, which beautifully ties up to the last presentation we had on COP26, is that new narratives need to be brought about in the discussion of modern heritage conservation. For example, energy efficiency and performance. And there are a lot of new calculations that can be done, which was possibly not available to people who designed those buildings during the 20th century. And once we do that, we also need to talk about reducing the carbon footprint, talking about energy emissions, energy consumptions, and are there ways in which modern heritage can be a tool to reduce carbon footprints? This is something we all need to think about. We also have been talking about widening the framework of modern heritage. So though the few examples we've been talking about are iconic buildings and iconic structures, what often gets lost is that there are each place or each geographic location, people of diverse parts of the world, they have different political history, economic history, social history associated with the 20th century. And diverse kinds of buildings, places, sites need to come into the forefront. And I think Nitya, Saranya, Priyanka beautifully brought out this point, and Rohit also to some extent. Lastly, I think two things which Rohit talked about is the risk assessment framework, and we need to be proactive, not reactive. And a lot of discussions on material conservation that have happened over the 2 days and also in the guided visits. How do we create a vocabulary of what the material palette of the modern heritage buildings have been, and how there are specific agents, how they react to it, how is the climate changing, are there ways we can devise frameworks, tools, guidelines to take care of our modern heritage. This is something we all need to think about, and possibly these are the varied interest areas where future research can chart its way ahead. That's it from my side. I think these are some of my random thoughts. If you have some, please add your thoughts to this, Harveen.
I completely contemplate with what you have said, Jim. And hearing and understanding the presentations that were held in the last 2 days and some of the previous work, I completely agree that how to address the impact of changing environmental conditions due to climate change on the deterioration of modern material. This is something which is very important for us to think and plan a way forward. Then another challenge which was pointed out in Dr. Rohit Jigyasu's presentation, that how to convince and work with the stakeholders of modern heritage to prevent these transformations is again very important. I'll give you a small example. We have a close by town, Ambala. So as part of the documentation project and some of our master's students, we went with a team to document some of the modern heritage buildings in Ambala. And we wanted to document a building, but the owner of the house, she was so scared that this property might, go out of her hands, that she does not let anyone get inside, because she's the only woman who's left in the family with the ownership of that house, which is a beautiful building. And it is into shambles, it is ruined. She's not even able to manage it, but she doesn't want any help from anyone because she thinks that she will lose her property in that case. So there is something called heritage awareness, which these stakeholders should also know and understand so that they become a part of this conservation process. Then again, planning for sustainable adaptive reuse for modern heritage buildings is again something very important that we need to think about. And something very interesting that I saw in the presentation by the Getty Conservation Institute, that they had a well chalked out plan for the coming year, what they are going to do, the workshops, the site visits, and all the projects that they're going to undertake. So as an institutional member of ICOMOS, I would like to propose and promote institutional collaborations so that we also have a plan for the coming year. Maybe we can sit together and then plan something with the experts, that what workshops, conferences, or site visits we can do in our zone, and at least promote heritage awareness and involve more people with us, so that we have more and more aware citizens, who think about this. And I think the ICOMOS Climate and Heritage Group, the Saranya, Darshani, and all who have presented, they can really contribute in this because they're actively working on those sites. So they can collaborate and be a part of these schools, the institutional partners, and help us in spreading this forward and taking this ahead. Another very interesting thing, Chandigarh is a beautiful city designed by Corbusier. And the Capitol complex that we took our students to was listed as UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016. We are right now placed in a campus which has many educational departments and a number of deans. But to our surprise, many of the deans and many of the other people in the organization, they did not know about this UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we have an interesting initiative in our university, which is called the Vice Chancellor Lecture Series, which is only for the heads and deans, where you take up a topic and present. So I took up this Capitol complex and I presented and I gave them insights, how it was listed, the history of Chandigarh, how the city's evolution took place. And similarly, Professor Kanika, she is recently going to Finland, to Metropolia University, as part of a semester exchange program. So the head there has, first of all, rather than, discussing the semester exchange and other courses, they first asked her, requested her to make a presentation on Capitol complex. Since you are coming from Chandigarh, they want their students to know about this heritage. So this was just to tell you that people around us, maybe staying in the same city, are also not aware of the heritage. So that is where we as schools of architecture can really contribute through our students, creating heritage awareness. And so we should have a well chalked out program for the coming year, how we are going to do our bit and how we are going to promote that heritage awareness. So that were some of the takeaways and points from my side. And I would now request you, Jayashree, to please sum it up and give the concluding remarks for the event.
Okay. All right. I thank all speakers and everyone on behalf of Chitkara, Center for Heritage Conservation, CEPT, and ICOMOS India for participating and for presenting your thoughts for this session. We hope that you've all enjoyed it. We've all enjoyed it, and we take something forward for the days to come. Thank you, everyone.
On behalf of Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, I would now invite Professor Sumit Wadhera, Dean Foundation Studies, to please extend a vote of thanks. Professor Sumit, okay.
Yeah, hello and good afternoon to everyone. It's indeed a pleasure for all of us here to have discussed a lot of impactful objectives and topics related to heritage, and that to modern heritage. And what rightfully you have summed up, Dr. Harveen, as well as yesterday's sessions also by Dr. Jigna, and currently what I was listening to. It is very imperative for all the people that, yes, we need to talk about the modern heritage. We need to understand its importance. And it is all the more important that this thing needs to be communicated to all the stakeholders, wherein the individual who is staying in those cities, who is actually a resident of those areas, but is very much unaware. A very valid point that you all have rightfully presented. And the exercise that you have done both at Chandigarh as well as Ahmedabad with the students, taking them to these heritage, making them understand the importance of these heritage. I would say the best idea is to make them relate to what they already have with them. So I extend my sincere thanks on behalf of entire Chitkara University, especially Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture, to all the panel members, all the presenters, as well as organizers from Chitkara School of Planning and Architecture and CEPT University, because this collaborative effort is the stepping stone which we all hope will go a long way, along with the ideologies of ICOMOS, to validate the ideology of making the human beings and all the stakeholders aware of our own heritage, appreciate it, and always value what we have with us. So with these words, I extend my sincere thanks to all the people who have given their valuable times for past 2 days, very time-oriented sessions, very knowledge-oriented sessions, a lot of complex knowledge shared to all the people in a very fantastic and a very light manner. I hope this collaboration further extends. I would just wind up that whatever efforts we all make with these sessions and these collaborative approaches, the idea was very well listed by Havelock Ellis, wherein he says that in philosophy, it is not the attainment of the goal that matters. It is the things that are met with by the way. So I hope that with the course of action and the 2 days that we have spent together, we have added a lot of value, and we hope that this collaboration will further go a long way, adding as well as attaining the purpose it was meant for. Thank you for all the speakers, all the organizers. Thanks a lot for extending your support to make this particular initiative a success. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sumit. We absolutely look forward to having many more such events in the future and many more such fruitful collaborations with institutional members of ICOMOS. And a special thanks to Mr. Karan, who's working behind the scene but has made this entire event live and possible. And thank you once again. Professor Kanika, would you like to say something and close the event?
Yeah, there has been a lot of deliberation. So thank you very much, Jayashree. I've troubled you a lot over these past few days.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Karan. I think Karan has been helping this in a way. Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Professor Wadhera, for these motivating words that you just said. I hope we'll get back all together in another event with more spirit and more motivation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.